In his 2019 book, Chaos, Tom O'Neill tells the story of his 20-year-long investigation into Charles Manson and the so-called Manson family cult, recontextualizing the murders at Sharon Tate's house as a deep event, with political implications far beyond those of a normal murder case. O'Neill accepts the case's prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi's argument that the killers were brainwashed puppets under Manson's control, but implies that the killings were actually consequences, intended or not, of various 60s-era CIA programs like MKUltra and Operation Chaos. Theories of intelligence agency involvement in the Tate LaBianca murders are nearly as old as the crimes themselves, but O'Neill's version is considered the most intellectually serious of the bunch, with actual CIA documents and first-person accounts to substantiate it. And in the process of laying out his case, O'Neill exposes District Attorney Bugliosi as a dishonest and unethical actor, willing to break the law and suborn perjury to get a conviction, while ironically reiterating his argument that the murders were part of an elaborate plot to inflame racial tensions in the United States. But what many of O'Neill's readers may not have realized is that among serious Manson case researchers and authors, Bugliosi's Helter Skelter narrative hasn't been taken seriously for decades, and O'Neill's work in this respect simply represents a mainstreaming of ideas that have been conventional wisdom on blogs and message boards for years. The bigger point of contention among Manson researchers is the question of motive. Why did the family kill those particular victims in those particular houses at that particular time? And O'Neill's thesis that the murders were the result of some kind of intelligence operation is just one theory of many, the most prominent of which being the love of brother theory represented by George Stimson and his book Goodbye Helter Skelter, where the killings were part of an ill-conceived scheme to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail, and the drug burn theory represented by Nikolas Schreck and his Manson File, where the murders were a result of mundane disputes between drug dealers. In this video, we'll examine the actual evidence marshaled by O'Neill in his argument for CIA involvement in, or influence on, the Tex Watson-Charles Manson murders, and go over what O'Neill found, and, just as importantly, what he left out, to see how well O'Neill's theory holds up when we go beyond chaos and draw from all the evidence available in the public record. In June of 1966, inmate Charles Manson was shipped to the federal prison on Terminal Island in Los Angeles to prepare for his upcoming parole. He was serving 7.5 years on a 10-year sentence, most of which he'd spent at McNeil Island Penitentiary. Manson was incarcerated on charges related to forging a $37 U.S. Treasury check, for which he'd originally been given probation, with the 10-year sentence suspended. But he ended up in prison after being caught transporting his wife and another woman to New Mexico for purposes of prostitution, and getting his probation violated. By the late 50s, Manson had been running a call girl ring called 3 Star Enterprises out of the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel in Los Angeles. Manson and an accomplice would approach naive new arrivals looking for acting work and promise to introduce them to film industry contacts if they put in a little paid time on the casting couch. Eventually, a man named Ralph Samuels informed Manson's 1950s parole officer that Manson had persuaded his 19-year-old daughter to invest all her savings in 3 Star Enterprises before pimping her out and impregnating her. Samuels tracked Manson to a hotel where he'd been living, and upon searching the room, found pornography featuring his daughter and Manson, which 3 Star Enterprises had been selling to clients in other states. It's worth noting here that adult content was illegal under U.S. obscenity laws until the 1970s, and the distribution channels that did exist were virtually entirely mafia-controlled, suggesting that Manson was no stranger to organized crime in California, even in the late 50s. But in March of 1967, Manson was finally released from the prison at Terminal Island under mandatory parole and picked up right where he left off. Only this time, his primary accomplice was an ex-con he'd met in prison named Bill Van Sickle, usually identified as Bill Vance in media about the case, under the auspices of a company called the Gerard Agency on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Gerard was like a staffing agency for sex work, hiring out its women to work as topless dancers for clubs and for other seedier purposes. The women Manson supplied were apparently perceived to be considerably less attractive than the other Gerard girls, but tougher and more street smart, so they were sent to the rougher jobs that would be too dangerous or frightening for the other girls. Later, during the family's time in Los Angeles, they spent considerable stretches living in two different houses which contained extensive camera equipment and photo labs enlisted in the production of pornography. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys would later gift Manson an early version of a camcorder, and in 1969, family members stole state-of-the-art camera equipment from the back of an NBC News truck, which was later recovered during the raid at Barker Ranch. According to the author Nikolas Schreck, for much of its existence, the family liked to present itself as something of a roving guerrilla film crew, and for a period traveled in a bus with the words Hollywood Productions, an accidental misspelling of Hollywood, painted on the side. But throughout his period with the family, Manson also maintained a lucrative side hustle producing porn. Despite its heavy focus on Haight-Ashbury and the early days of Manson's Parole, Chaos spends precious little time describing what Manson was actually up to during this period. Media coverage about Manson often plays up his supposedly failed efforts to build a music career, but in his first few months of freedom, Manson was actually remarkably successful at making inroads in the entertainment industry. He was playing his music at local shows and parties in San Francisco and LA. And despite Bugliosi's claims about Manson's supposed lack of talent, over the following years, he spent time hanging out and jamming with numerous 1960s rock stars, including Frank Zappa, Neil Young, and the Beach Boys, among others. By the late 60s, prisoners and ex-convicts had serious cachet in left-wing intellectual and counterculture circles. Ex-cons and imprisoned activists like George Jackson, Eldridge Cleaver, and Geronimo Pratt had become celebrities in their own right and were being feted as the vanguard of a coming revolution. In Hollywood, having personal connections to prisoners and ex-cons was ironically considered rather glamorous, and the younger, more avant-garde members of the Hollywood elite held star-studded fundraisers for the Black Panthers and specific quote-unquote political prisoners who'd taken up activist causes while incarcerated. And within 3 months of Manson being paroled into this environment, he was hired by a producer named Gary Stromberg to work on a planned Universal Pictures movie about Jesus being reincarnated as a black man in 1960s America. By this time, Manson had already built a reputation in the countercultural scene as a kind of experimental singer-songwriter/spiritual guru, and he was tasked by Stromberg with consulting on the film's script and composing the soundtrack with a South African musician. The project eventually fell apart, but Manson had free access to the Universal lot and used the opportunity to establish himself in another industry: hustling. Manson was notorious for his priapism, and it turned out there were plenty of closeted men eager for some rough trade at Universal. Through the decades of his later incarceration, Manson consistently told one story about striking up a conversation with the actor Cary Grant's assistant, who brought Manson into Grant's office and had the first of many sexual encounters with him. Manson provided similar services for Wild Wild West star Robert Conrad and Peter Falk of Columbo fame, among others. It was during this early phase of his parole that Manson, the experienced pimp and pornographer, began recruiting the girls who would come to be known as his family. The media generally likes to focus on the girls who joined Manson from stable, middle-class upbringings, and to be clear, some of his earliest followers, like Mary Bruner, a UC Berkeley librarian, and Patricia Krenwinkel, a secretary who lived with her sister, do fit this description. But the media stereotype doesn't do justice to the desperate circumstances many of Charlie's girls found themselves in before joining the family. For example, Susan Atkins had a tragic home life and had been a topless dancer and call girl long before ever meeting Manson. Lynette Fromey, and Fromey is the correct pronunciation, according to Lynette herself, had been kicked out of her parents' house after an argument and made a split-second decision to follow Manson after encountering him while living rough on Venice Beach. Dianne Lake's parents had taken her to live on a commune, but the commune leaders encouraged the then 14-year-old to leave after deeming her jailbait, so her parents sent her to San Francisco unsupervised and later encouraged Manson to go find her there. In fact, despite the popular conception of the Manson family as a cult, there isn't much of a consensus among serious Manson case researchers regarding the cult label. and some reject it entirely, believing the family can be more accurately characterized as a commune, a group marriage, pimping and human trafficking, or just Charlie Manson's groupies. The famous study of the Manson family written by Alan Rose before the murders was actually titled A Case Study of the Charles Manson Group Marriage Commune, because that was how the family was perceived before the crimes and all the media attention that resulted. Manson himself always mocked the idea that he'd ever been a cult leader, and insisted that the Manson family name was just a corruption of the name of his musical group, the Family Jams.
Do you want to come back?
Come back where?
With more followers.
Oh, come on, more followers. Get it, just a ball of boom boom, baby, bucks on Brandon.
You said you were the heart of the place.
I had no followers.
You said you were the energy of the place.
I was the energy of the place only because I was there. I didn't even realize I was the energy of the place. You know, I didn't know everybody out there was dead. I really didn't. You know, I really honestly didn't know that everybody was running on what someone else said.
You convicted me for being the motivating force behind your children, and some of them I only know.
God forbid.
Yeah, and I knew Linda Kasabian. I seen her 3 times in my life, maybe 2 minutes in my whole life I seen the broad. She come up to the ranch for about a week, and she said, "Hey, my name is Linda." I said, "Oh, Linda." She said, "Can I stay here?" I said, "Can you stay here?" She said, "I'd like to live at the ranch." I said, "I'd like to live at the ranch." She said, "Well, can I stay here?" I said, "Can I f you?" She says, "Yeah," and I put my hand up her dress, and I said, "Yeah, okay, you can stay around." That's the biggest thought in my head, was getting at her body. I wasn't thinking about sending her down to be no troops about saving nothing or stopping nothing.
Now here's one of my sins, and I'll confess to you clearly and openly to the world. I never realized how much mind I was holding with those people. I never realized how weak you people are outside. I've been raised up inside with these guys. These guys are powerhouses. These guys are strong men. I've been raised up amongst men all my life. And I go out there and I tell someone, "Come over here and sit down." They go, "Whoop, you sit down." They say, "How do you do that?" I don't know, what? You know, in other words, like, they do it to me in prison. That's the way this guy tells me. He says, "Get over here, tell Raw, put your hands in law." So I learn to do what he says, and I just go out and do what he says. So I'm reflecting reflections on that are reflected to me, and I can reflect no more to you than's been reflected to me, you dig? So I go through all these changes, and all these people coming in, they say, "Can we be with you?" And I look at them and I say, "No." And they say, "Why can't we be with you?" I said, "Because I'm with me. Can you be with yourself?" And they say, "Yes." I said, "What do you need me for?" Here, you got a psychotic episode with 150 people. You got 150 people running through Hollywood, playing music, smoking dope, having sex orgies, riding motorcycles. All I was one little small music group called the Family Jams, man.
Well, that's just not the obese people.
Yeah.
You know obese people?
Wait a minute. And not only that, all these girls that you keep attributing me to were just girls that happened to be in their subculture that was in that free love trip.
How about Tex and the girls? You think they're going to go?
Tex is Tex, man. I didn't know that guy that well anyway. I only met him a few times. He used to work on some trucks there at the ranch.
If somebody else comes up and lies on theirs and they're snitching to that cop and they're writing notes and they get busted and they get their throats cut, hey, what can I say? They say, "You made it happen." I didn't make nothing happen, man. I can only be responsible for one human being. My own self. I'm responsible for this guy. And everybody in the so-called Manson family that you guys gave me after I got busted, which there was no such thing as a Manson family. It was a musical group called Family Jams.
Oh, God.
The version of Manson's story where he was a pimp exploiting vulnerable women doesn't graft easily onto O'Neill's depiction of Manson as a brainwashing Svengali. And so when it comes to the family's early days, Chaos neglects the sex angle almost completely in favor of a more narrow concern, namely Manson's parole and his relationship with a parole officer named Roger Smith. In the Chaos narrative, Smith's role was to cover for Manson's lawbreaking and ignore the terms of his parole to keep Manson out of prison by any means necessary. But O'Neill notes that Manson's actual parole file was apparently 4 inches thick at the time of his 1970 trial, while O'Neill's Freedom of Information Act requests produced only 69 pages. And since the publication of Chaos, it's become clear that at least some of the seeming anomalies O'Neill identified in Manson's parole would have been easily explained if he had a more complete copy of the record. For example, consider the very first claim about Manson's parole that O'Neill leads off with in his Rogan interview. I can't play the audio for copyright reasons, but O'Neill says, quote, "One of the other things I found out that was very significant was that Manson had a parole officer who had given him a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card for the first year after Manson was released from prison in 1967, Roger Smith. He was a criminologist in the Bay Area. Manson violated his parole the day he was released in Los Angeles, and you think it's a little lie, but it's an important lie, that Vincent Bugliosi presented not just at trial, but in his book. He changed the narrative. He said Manson had been given permission to travel to San Francisco from LA when Manson was paroled. Manson hadn't been given that permission. He just showed up there. They originally were going to violate him, send him right back to prison, and someone stepped in and took care of that and let Manson stay in San Francisco, and he was assigned to Roger Smith. However, in 2024, the Manson scholars over at the Manson blog published a hitherto unreleased document from Manson's parole file, and it turns out that on the very day he was released from Terminal Island, March 21, 1967, he was explicitly given permission to travel to San Francisco, Spokane, and Seattle for the purpose of, quote, locating relatives and establishing employment. Near the bottom of the page, someone wrote in by hand the addresses of the federal parole offices in those cities, along with Roger Smith's name and phone number. This document is interesting for a number of reasons. First, it clearly invalidates O'Neill's claim that Manson violated parole on his first day out by leaving Los Angeles, since it proves that he was given permission to travel the day of his release. Look at the dates on the signatures. It's not like it was backdated or something. But more importantly, O'Neill is claiming that he has documents from the federal parole office showing that they almost violated Manson for leaving Los Angeles, even though he'd gotten permission to do so from a different PO in the same city. This means the parole office was so disorganized that they'd already lost track of the terms of Manson's parole by his first day out of prison. O'Neill's assertion that someone, quote, stepped in and took care of that is also telling. Rather than allowing for the possibility of mundane incompetence on the part of the parole office, he immediately assumes malice and a wider conspiracy. And unfortunately, this isn't the only part of chaos where O'Neill appears to have speculated far beyond what the actual evidence allows. O'Neill discovered that Manson had been an unknowing participant in a National Institutes of Mental Health funded research study called the San Francisco Project, which analyzed the effects of parole supervision on outcomes for ex-convicts. Running from 1964 to 68, the San Francisco Project assigned parole officers caseloads of either 20, 40, about 100, or about 350 parolees to see if those officers with smaller caseloads would produce better outcomes for their clients. Roger Smith was assigned a caseload of 40, one of which was Charles Manson. But O'Neill goes on to claim that by the end of 1967, the year Manson was released from Terminal Island, Roger Smith had inexplicably been taken off all of his other cases, and from then on had Manson as his only parole client. For whatever reason, O'Neill doesn't actually say how he came to this conclusion in the book, and if you check the footnotes for this section, he says, quote, Roger Smith was vague about when and if Manson ever became his only client. The implication here is that O'Neill asked Roger Smith if Manson had been his only assigned parolee during that period, and Smith either said he didn't remember or otherwise failed to answer the question. So if this claim didn't come from Roger Smith, then where did it come from? The only evidence O'Neill provides is buried in the footnotes. Gail Sedala and Alan Rose, both of whom assisted Smith, said Manson was the only parolee they were aware of who came to the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic for meetings with Smith. But these two witnesses, Gail Sedala and Alan Rose, said that Manson was the only parole client who saw Smith at the Free Medical Clinic, not his only parolee in general. Did O'Neill have any other, better evidence which he just failed to mention in chaos? Apparently not. I got the screenshot from Paul of the Paulcast, aka the Manson Saga discussion panel, showing that when O'Neill was asked if he had any documentation proving that Manson had been Roger Smith's only parole client, he said no. So if O'Neill admits that his only evidence is the testimony from Gail Sedala and Alan Rose, and neither of them actually said that Roger Smith had been assigned Manson as his only parolee, then how did O'Neill even draw this conclusion in the first place? We'll return to the issue of Manson's parole later, but for now we need to address one of the other central pillars of the chaos narrative, the issue of brainwashing and the role of Dr. Lewis Jolly West. West was a psychiatrist who'd studied hypnosis and brainwashing going back to at least the early 1950s, when he was involved in the quote-unquote deprogramming of returning POWs from the Korean War. After a period working as a doctor at Lackland Air Force Base, West became head of the Oklahoma School of Medicine's psychiatry department in 1954. After a period working as a doctor at Lackland Air Force Base, West became head of the Oklahoma School of Medicine's psychiatry department in 1954. And according to O'Neill, he received MKUltra funding through CIA cutouts for at least the next 11 years. West would later take up an academic post at UCLA, and over his decades-long career, published research papers on topics including brainwashing, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, dissociation, cults, hallucinogens, and hippie culture, and would become the go-to expert on brainwashing cults for the legal system and the media. Along with his work on the Jimmy Shaver and Jack Ruby cases, West engaged in a years-long public feud with the Church of Scientology and testified for the defense in Patricia Hearst's criminal case, contending that her involvement with the Symbionese Liberation Army had been a result of brainwashing she'd been subjected to by the group's leader, Donald DeFreeze. Despite its detailed exploration of West's career and CIA connections, Chaos spends precious little time describing his actual methods of mind control or how they might relate to Manson's treatment of the family. But if we want to determine whether or not Jolly West's MKUltra research had any influence on Manson's supposed brainwashing tactics, then we need to find out what similarities, if any, exist between them. Because if Charles Manson really learned his mind control techniques from Jolly West, then we should be able to identify at least some traces of that influence. West's earliest known mind control work was his supposed deprogramming of Air Force POWs returning from the Korean War. O'Neill says that West claimed to have studied 83 POWs, 56 of whom had been forced to make what O'Neill calls false confessions. Many of these confessions had to do with accusations from the Chinese and Koreans that the Americans had been using banned biological weapons during the war, accusations which the American government denied at the time, but which are now widely regarded as credible. Exactly how much of West's treatment was for actual deprogramming, and how much was just a wartime cover-up, is at the very least an open question. But nevertheless, many of the POWs had been subjected to various forms of physical and psychological torture, and West and his colleagues were credited with getting them to retract their confessions and reintegrate into American society. Regarding the tactics the Korean and Chinese governments had supposedly used to brainwash the POWs, West concluded that rather than drugs or hypnosis, the only mind-altering influence the POWs had been subjected to was a prolonged loss of sleep. There are frustratingly few surviving documents detailing West's actual mind control experiments, but O'Neill uncovered correspondence between West and CIA scientist Sidney Gottlieb, which gives a glimpse into West's research plans circa 1953, towards the beginning of his relationship with the agency. In a letter from June of that year, West told Gottlieb he wanted to conduct experiments examining the degree to which information can be extracted from presumably unwilling subjects through hypnosis alone or in combination with certain drugs, possibly with subsequent amnesia. He wanted to explore techniques for implanting false information into particular subjects, or for inducing in them specific mental disorders, and to create hypnotic couriers who could carry secret messages in their subconscious minds. West further expressed an intention to perform experiments using a combination of psychotropic drugs and hypnosis. He offered a 9-point list of short and long-term research goals, including reversing a subject's belief system without his knowledge, and studying the induction of trance states by drugs. But at least in this correspondence, West seems to be talking about hypothetical future studies he plans to conduct, not currently ongoing research. So this document alone can't actually tell us what West was or wasn't doing at Lackland. The record of West's time at the University of Oklahoma, however, is less ambiguous. In 1956, West received a $20,000 grant as part of MKUltra Subproject 43 to fund a proposal he'd submitted to the CIA titled Psychophysiological Studies of Hypnosis and Suggestibility. You can read the relevant text from the proposal that's on the screen now, but according to the book Brainwash by Dominic Streatfield, MKUltra Subproject 43 suggested the construction of a unique laboratory containing a special chamber in which all aspects of the physical environment could be minutely controlled by the operator. A later CIA document explained how it worked. In the room, unwilling subjects would be forced to believe that they were succumbing to hypnotic induction even if they were fighting it. A number of devices, wrote West, would be used to convince the subject that he's responding to suggestions. Hidden heaters could be used to warm the man's hand when he was instructed to feel hot. Alternatively, he could be persuaded under hypnotism that cigarettes would taste bitter, then presented with a doctored cigarette. With ingenuity, he concluded, a large variety of suggestions can be made to come true by means unknown to the subject. Once the subject believed that, despite his best efforts to resist, he was indeed under the hypnotist's influence, he would give in and allow himself to fall into a trance. This was the same proposal where West claimed that he'd already developed a method of replacing true memories with false ones in human subjects without their knowledge. It's been found to be feasible to take the memory of a definite event in the life of an individual and, through hypnotic suggestion, bring about the subsequent conscious recall to the effect that this event never actually took place, but that a different, fictional event actually did occur. West claimed he'd accomplished this by administering new drugs effective in speeding the induction of the hypnotic state, and in deepening the trance that can be produced in given subjects. West said he had hypnotized mental patients and, quote, normal subjects and exposed them to a host of drugs, including chlorpromazine, reserpine, amphetamines, and LSD. But according to West, acid made people more difficult to hypnotize. It was better to pair hypnosis with long bouts of isolation and sleep deprivation. Using hypnotic suggestion, he claimed a person can be told that it's now a year later, and during the course of this year, many changes have taken place, so that it's now acceptable for him to discuss matters that he previously felt he should not discuss. An individual who insists he desires to do one thing will reveal that secretly he wishes just the opposite. But in the same 1956 research proposal, West admits that most of his test subjects up to that point had been mental patients, which according to West made standardized observations very difficult. O'Neill notes that West worked on a CIA-backed project in Oklahoma titled Mass Conversion, a study in which he hired informants to infiltrate teenage gangs and engender a fundamental change in basic moral, religious, or political matters. And in 1963, West gave an address to the Mental Health Association of Oregon, in which he claimed that he developed a way to induce insanity in otherwise sane test subjects under laboratory conditions. We're at the dawning of a new era, learning for the first time to produce temporary mental derangement in the laboratory. According to a news report of the event, West said he'd accomplished this using LSD and other drugs, along with hypnosis and sleep deprivation. Reporting that West had done extensive work with LSD, the news article continued, "The most important contribution of LSD so far is in producing model mental illnesses." Another theme that ran throughout West's research was his preoccupation with the psychiatric phenomenon of dissociation, where an individual becomes detached from their thoughts, memories, feelings, or identity, as can happen during fugue states, or with depersonalization and derealization disorder. West believed that hypnosis was a form of induced, temporary dissociation, and suggested that the same effects could be produced using certain drugs, sleep deprivation, and sensory isolation. He seemed to think that dissociative states had important implications for brainwashing, especially when it came to inducing amnesia, and at least once proposed using patients already suffering from dissociative disorders as test subjects for mind control research. So in essence, West claimed that he'd either already mastered, or was currently working on, establishing complete control over a subject's memory, including inducing amnesia and removing and implanting memories at will, creating unknowing couriers who could have information stored in their subconscious mind without any conscious awareness of or access to that information, using drugs, hypnosis, and sleep deprivation to induce specific mental disorders and temporary insanity in unwilling subjects, changing a subject's belief system without their knowledge or consent, the induction of trance and dissociative states using drugs and hypnosis, and the extraction of information from unwilling subjects using drugs and hypnosis. but Jolly West's alleged connections to the Charles Manson case come from one specific nexus: his relationship with the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic and the hippie crash pad he opened in a crumbling Victorian house in the same neighborhood. In 1966, West received a government grant to fund a sabbatical from his professorship at the University of Oklahoma, ostensibly to pursue a fellowship at Stanford, but according to O'Neill, there's no record he ever actually enrolled in the fellowship. By the late fall of '66, West was in San Francisco, and in June of '67, he opened the Haight-Ashbury Project, which he described as a laboratory disguised as a hippie crash pad, funded by a CIA front called the Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry. The 6-month project involved decorating the house in stereotypical hippie fashion and installing 6 graduate students to live there full-time, telling them to dress like hippies and lure itinerant kids into the apartment. Passers-by were welcome to do as they pleased and stay as long as they liked, as long as they didn't mind grad students taking copious notes on their behavior. David Smith, the founder of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, gave West an office there, allowing him to interview the clinic's patients and attempt to recruit them to the crash pad. O'Neill writes that no one, including David Smith, seemed to know what the project's actual goals were, and the only task the grad students were given was to keep diaries. According to O'Neill, the grad students weren't sure what they were supposed to be doing, or why West was there, and often he wasn't there. Unlike the grad students, he didn't live at the pad, but he wasn't putting in long hours at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic either. Those who knew him at both places, and elsewhere in his long career, recalled his chronic absenteeism. When crashers showed up, no one made much of a point of finding out about them, but more often, hippies failed to show up at all. Back in 1959, West had participated in a CIA-funded conference about the psychiatric applications of LSD, the proceedings of which were published as a book where West was quoted extensively. In one of those quotations, West asks, "To what extent does the subjective experience of the therapist or the observer, who almost inevitably has taken LSD himself, influence the results he finds in therapy?" The therapist has almost inevitably taken LSD himself? Was West implicitly admitting that he'd taken LSD, which would still have been legal in 1959? If this was our only data point, it would be hard to say. But in Chaos, O'Neill quotes from the diary of one of the graduate students from the crash pad named Kathy Collins, saying, "When West made one of his rare appearances at the crash pad, he was dressed funny, like a hippie. Sometimes he would have friends in tow, costumed just as poorly." Collins wrote, "The rest of us tended to look to them in trying to understand what we were supposed to do or what Jolly wanted. Their general reply was that this was a good opportunity to have fun. I gather that they did. They spent a good deal of the time stoned. I feel like no one's being honest. What is West trying to prove? He's interested in drugs, that's clear. What else?" So according to Chaos, during his short time in San Francisco, Jolly West was double-dipping on government grants, walking around the Haight dressed like a hippie, getting loaded all the time, barely showing up to work. And on the rare occasions when he did, and the grad students asked him what they were supposed to be doing, he'd give flippant non-answers like, "Is this an asphalt Sherwood forest?" O'Neill quotes West's colleagues describing him as a devious, egotistical narcissist and a manipulative psychopath who failed miserably in his attempts to blend into the hippie milieu. And he somehow published multiple academic papers about the crash pad project, despite the fact that he apparently rarely went there and never even bothered to collect any research data. It's worth remembering that O'Neill said that the graduate students actually lived in the crash pad, and according to one of the resulting papers West wrote, the co-director of the project, a child psychiatrist, was there full-time as well. So when was all this supposed brainwashing going on? It's at least hypothetically possible that the crash pad study was just a cover story, and the CIA gave West a do-nothing job because they wanted him in the Bay Area working on other classified projects. But after reading through all of the material that's publicly available about Jolly West, and the overwhelmingly negative assessments of him that O'Neill elicited from his former colleagues, I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy was probably just defrauding the government. And that remained a hunch until I found this document. It turns out that in the early 80s, West was actually investigated by the FBI for submitting fraudulent time cards to the Veterans Administration, billing them for consulting work that he never completed. Of course, Chaos doesn't mention any of this, because that means it's entirely plausible that the Crash Pad project was just a scheme to bilk money from the government so West could screw around in San Francisco during the Summer of Love. Isn't that exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a manipulative, psychopathic womanizer like Jolly West? O'Neill reports that in 1956, West told the CIA that he'd successfully devised a method of replacing true memories with false ones in human subjects without their knowledge, using a combination of drugs and hypnosis. But O'Neill got these quotes from a letter West had written to Sidney Gottlieb asking for CIA money, not scientific research papers or study data. We don't know what mind control techniques West was supposedly using that produced such incredible results. And in fact, we don't have any data at all showing that his techniques even worked in the first place. We don't have any testimony from research assistants saying they saw West brainwash anyone. We don't have any research subjects saying they were victims of West's mind control. The only evidence we have showing that Jolly West ever successfully brainwashed anyone is testimony from West himself, which means the whole argument hinges on West's credibility as a witness. And if West was willing to cheat on his wife, be chronically absent from his CIA-funded research job, show up to work stoned, and defraud the VA, then we need to seriously consider the possibility that he was just lying about his mind control accomplishments. Ironically, despite his credulous reporting of West's supposed scientific discoveries, even O'Neill had to admit that West's papers were, quote, light on specifics and skimped on the details. And ultimately, he was unable to find any evidence that Jolly West had encountered Charles Manson even once, at the hippie crash pad, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, or anywhere else for that matter. And despite its overwhelming emphasis on MKUltra and brainwashing, Chaos devotes only a few pages to the actual mind control techniques employed by Manson in his treatment of the family. So how did Jolly West's brainwashing methods compare to Manson's? For this next part, we're going to have to zoom out a little bit. So Manson initially moved in with Mary Bruner shortly after his release from Terminal Island, but for most of 1967 and 68, he was relatively transient. According to Nikolas Schreck, Manson admitted that while living in the Bay Area, he'd been involved in the murder of a San Francisco drug dealer who went by the street name Super Spade, and although I couldn't determine if this was the precipitating event that led Manson to relocate, he would soon spend a considerable period living in and around Los Angeles in vehicles, abandoned houses, and addresses connected to the Girard Agency, always with multiple female companions. You may remember from Tom O'Neill's Joe Rogan interview the story of Manson's mysterious job offer in Mexico. O'Neill says that Roger Smith requested permission for Manson to travel to Mexico to, quote, survey soil for insecticides, and when Rogan asks him who was hiring Charles Manson to survey soil, O'Neill says it was a company that mysteriously disappeared a couple years later, the obvious but unstated implication being that it was some type of front company, perhaps for an intel agency or organized crime. What O'Neill didn't mention in the interview, however, is that the person making this job offer was a man named Dean Morehouse. In reality, this supposed job offer was just a letter Morehouse had written to Roger Smith claiming that he represented the Permagard Corporation of Phoenix, Arizona, and that he wanted to employ Manson not to survey soil, but to survey the Mexican market for interest in soil additives and insecticides. Now, as anyone familiar with the Manson case already knows, Dean Morehouse was a kind of traveling minister/hippie guru who's often identified as an early recruit to the Manson family, and who would later give his teenage daughter, Ruth Ann Morehouse, permission to join the family. But there's no indication that Roger Smith was aware of any of this, and it appears that he just accepted the letter at face value without looking into Morehouse's background at all. And if you read Manson's parole file, it turns out that Manson was just having his friends pose as employers and tell the parole office that they'd hired Manson to work for them, so Manson wouldn't have to get a real job. The idea that Dean Morehouse, of all people, was running a secret front company in Mexico is frankly laughable. In reality, this is almost certainly just a case of Manson trying to trick his parole officer into letting him leave the country. And think about the implications here. If Manson could fool Roger Smith into almost letting him move to Mexico just by having his friend send Smith a single letter, that suggests Smith was so gullible or incompetent that he wasn't even taking basic steps to verify the information he was receiving from or about Manson. Tom O'Neill certainly knows who Dean Morehouse is, and he knows that this Mexico episode wasn't a case of secret agents or front companies. But the fact that he chose to frame the story as evidence of a conspiracy rather than glaring incompetence or naivety on Smith's part tells us a lot about the lens through which O'Neill interprets evidence. There are widely divergent theories about how Manson actually met Dennis Wilson. The official story was that Wilson picked up some hitchhiking girls and they told him about their guru, Charlie. But by June of 1968, Manson was telling his parole officer that he was living at Dennis Wilson's house and that he'd been offered a contract with the Beach Boys record company, Brother Records, worth $20,000 a year. And this wasn't simply a fantasy on Manson's part. Dennis Wilson was clearly enamored with Manson and gave an interview to Rave magazine the same year in which he referred to Manson as the Wizard and said he, quote, may be another artist for Brother Records. By June 3, 1968, Roger Smith had ceased being Manson's parole officer, and the same month, his new PO called the Beach Boys manager, who, when asked about the supposed record contract, said that he'd never approved the offer and that his company would have to be idiotic to sponsor Manson in any manner. This is something of a pattern in Manson's relationships with Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys, and his other contacts in the music industry, like the producer Terry Melcher, where performers and record producers seemingly made promises to Manson about contracts or monetary compensation, which their business managers would fail to fulfill. For instance, in May of 1969, Manson got permission from his parole officer to travel to Texas to perform with the Beach Boys there, but the band left for Texas without him. In December of 1968, Manson told his PO that he was due to be paid $5,000 by the Beach Boys for one of the two songs they'd recorded which were written by Manson, but the payment never materialized. In August of 1968, however, Manson and his group would settle at Spahn Ranch in LA County, the site which is most associated with Manson's alleged brainwashing of the family. It's worth noting here that Bugliosi's narrative of the family's cult-like existence at Spahn Ranch is strikingly similar to the story of another cult which had lived just a few miles away 20 years earlier, Krishna Venta's Fountain of the World. Elements of Krishna Venta's cult, a leader calling himself Jesus Christ, staging mock crucifixions and indulging in exploitative sexual relationships with his followers, were so similar to the story Bugliosi presented at trial that some believed he'd used Krishna Venta as inspiration when crafting the cult narrative. And Manson himself sometimes floated this theory in interviews.
Don't you think Jesus would be appalled that you were invoking his name?
I didn't invoke any name. They put that on me. The spirit laid that over on my track. They said I was Krishna Venta. Krishna Venta died in Box Canyon in 1949, and they put that cult over on me. That was a cult that was in Box Canyon in 1949 when I was in reform school, 20 years before I even grew up. They put that guy on me and said that I called myself and I stood up on the cross and I did that. I didn't do all that. That wasn't me. I ran with a vato named Jesus. He spelled his name Jesus. He was Panamanian, you dig?
The blind, elderly owner of Spahn Ranch, George Spahn, agreed to provide Manson with free room and board in exchange for working as a ranch hand alongside other men who were already living there under similar arrangements, like Juan Flynn and Donald Shorty Shea. But Manson quickly built an outsized presence there, inviting others to live on the ranch in a commune-style arrangement, and occasionally paying off Spahn with money, vehicles, and attention from his female followers. The male family members were usually made to do manual labor in exchange for their spot at the ranch, and the women were expected to cook, clean, and be sexually available. For example, in the warrant application for the Spahn Ranch raid, police wrote that Manson, quote, forces the juvenile females to give the various men at the ranch baths in a large wooden tub. It's also important to understand that while the high-control cult descriptor might apply to certain people on the ranch at certain times, this was not at all uniform over the life of the group at Spahn Ranch. In fact, for much of its existence, it more closely resembled some kind of combination commune, crash pad for runaways and criminals, summer camp, and homeless shelter. For instance, one of the soon-to-be murderers, Susan Atkins, and others, were allowed to leave the ranch at will and lived in other locations for stretches of the Spahn Ranch cult period. Tex Watson moved to the ranch just 9 months before the murders because he needed a place to hide out after robbing someone in Los Angeles, and Manson made Watson give him a truck in exchange for permission to stay. Tex would also leave the ranch in the period directly preceding the murders to hide out again after robbing an LA drug dealer named Bernard Crow. And Linda Kasabian, one of the only 3 people who were in the car both nights of the Tate LaBianca murders, had only come to the commune a month or so before the crimes. Needless to say, the narrative of Manson being constantly on the lookout for new followers to recruit doesn't hold up to scrutiny. In virtually every case, there was some kind of quid pro quo arrangement with the people Manson allowed to stay on the ranch. Starting well before the murders, the family would engage in a practice they called creepy crawls, where they would break into unsuspecting people's homes in the middle of the night, usually to steal valuables, but also, at least in some cases, merely to cause mischief. On some creepy crawls, family members would supposedly just rearrange furniture without actually taking anything, just to freak out the house's occupants. Frequent targets included rich neighborhoods and the family members' own parents' houses. Under the brainwashing theory, creepy crawls would obviously help to break down the participants' inhibitions and acclimate them to the process of committing what were essentially home invasion robberies. That way, by the night of the murders, breaking into someone's house would seem like no big deal. It's also worth noting that Leno LaBianca told his family that he'd noticed signs of repeated break-ins at the house in the months leading up to the murders. It isn't known for sure if the family had anything to do with them, but it's certainly reasonable speculation. The evidence also seems to suggest that Manson enforced a moral code on the ranch which would be considered deviant or backwards compared to the wider American culture of the time.
All right, now that's another game altogether. Sure. That can be explained too. There's a place called Indian Mesa where we have fires and we play music. And we make big circles, like you do with the Stones. We make big circles and we sing. Ah! And we put our souls in each other, you dig? In other words, and we have sex with each other, and we each other. And we do all the things that you guys are not allowed to do in your culture. But in the culture I live in, we throw all that out the window, and that's what I guess you'd call Satan. Okay. I wouldn't call it Satan, I'd just call it... Let's call it whatever. You call it time of day if you want. But that was what was happening in those times, in those days,
Manson was highly misogynistic, treating women as sex objects and natural homemakers, and he was racist, maintaining the same hostility and separatist tendencies he'd absorbed in prison. This is partly why Manson rejected the label of hippie, because the egalitarian and integrationist values at the heart of hippiedom were anathema to him. The family preferred to call themselves slippies because they would slip beneath society's conscious awareness, like with their creepy crawls. Manson demanded that everyone's property, including money, be shared communally, which would obviously make it harder to leave. But much of the cultural deprogramming he engaged in resembled the same kind of education in the convict code that Manson had received while being raised inside the prison system. Besides a strong prohibition on snitching, Manson told the family members what to do if they got arrested, how to survive in prison by acting tough or crazy, and put a supreme emphasis on telling the truth, and how a man is only as good as his word. Judging from his interviews, Manson clearly understood the crimes and his role in the family in terms of the underworld code. So if we take Manson at his word, he seems to have viewed the family less as a cult than as a kind of ersatz prison gang, composed of the throwaway kids of the middle class.
I live in another world. Okay. I was raised up that you don't get involved in other people's business. Okay. If they're doing something, that's them. They got to ride that beef. That's a jailhouse law. Ride your own beef, do your own time. And I've done that all my life. If Tex goes off and he kills 8 or 10 people and he comes and Bobby comes back and says, I killed him. I said, man, don't tell me about it. I don't want to hear it, It's none of my affair. I get out of jail and these kids come around me. Yeah. They say, you're God. You have the voice of God. And I say, there's a whole penitentiary guys like me. I'm nothing. I'm just a messenger. I'm a witness, that's all. I'm just a poop butt that dropped out of the penitentiary. And they seen something in me I didn't see in me.
What'd they see?
They seen a nice guy. And I'm not a nice guy.
I agree.
But they seen that. So I said, well, As long as they see the nice guy, I'll reflect the nice guy. I'll be the nice guy to them. So I played as much nice guy as they could deal with. And I held the line of nice guy. And I looked out for everybody, and I gave them places to stay, and I kept all the other not so nice guys off of them.
I hear you, so.
You dig what I'm saying?
Yep.
Because I like the kids, because I can identify with the kids, because they didn't have nobody like I didn't have nobody.
Right.
So I kind of identify with that balance, Dick.
Her daddy's a rocket scientist. He makes rockets and Boeing aircraft. And I met her on a street corner. She didn't have no place to stay. Her parents kicked her out, you know. And I knew what her heart was and where she was running and what she was doing, because that's an old garbage can to me. I've run through that before. How do you feel that an ex-convict can get out of jail and go find rocket scientist children out in the garbage cans? Go home. I can't. My mother, my father won't let me. They're drunks. They hate me. They say that I was a leader in a family of people, which is bull. That's bunk. I had a lot of friends. But all the kids, they would come to me and say, we got no place to go. And I'd say, well, I got no place to go. You know, so they were throwaway kids, and I was a throwaway kid.
And before we get to the family members' actual first-hand reports of Manson's brainwashing, there's an important note about context that we need to discuss. It's virtually universally agreed among Manson case experts that the narrative presented by Bugliosi at trial, which became the official story of the Manson family, was largely an invention of the prosecution, reverse-engineered by the DA to cover up embarrassing details about prominent people and the investigation, and to give himself the best possible chance of convicting everyone who was charged, including Manson. So even though the trial narrative is, at this point, widely acknowledged as fiction, the fact remains that the incarcerated family members were convicted under this version of the story. And here's the important part. If you're a convict who wants to be let out on parole in California, the absolute worst thing you can do for your case is to accuse the prosecutors of lying or fabricating evidence, even if the accusation is true. The imprisoned family members are all trying to get paroled, and in California that means they have to, quote, take responsibility for the crimes they were convicted of. In other words, they have to affirm the prosecution narrative if they ever want to get out of prison. Patricia Krenwinkel, Bruce Davis, and Tex Watson have been telling the parole board the same story for decades, that they were brainwashed to murder people because of Terry Melcher, the Beatles, and a race war prophecy. So if any of them were to turn around and say, actually I wasn't brainwashed and I never believed in the Helter Skelter stuff anyway, the parole board would say they aren't taking responsibility, they're changing their story, minimizing their crimes, etc., and find them unfit for parole. This means that every living family member who might actually be able to set the record straight, namely Tex Watson, Bruce Davis, Patricia Krenwinkel, and even Leslie Van Houten, despite her recent parole, has a massive incentive to stick to the official story regarding brainwashing and the motive. So for this next part, it's worth keeping in mind that it's in the family members' interest to portray themselves as brainwashed, to minimize their culpability and affirm the prosecution narrative, regardless of the truth. And so with that caveat, what have the family members actually said about mind control? The first example is from well before the Spahn Ranch period, when Manson and the girls first encountered Dianne Lake. At this point, Lake had been sent unaccompanied to San Francisco by her parents after she was declared jailbait by the leaders of the commune her parents lived on. Lake's parents had met Manson and gave him Dianne's name and picture, telling Manson to find her the next time he was in San Francisco. This is how Dianne describes her first time meeting Manson in her book, Member of the Family. A couple she'd been living with brought her to a party at the Spiral Staircase house in LA where the family was staying. After arriving, she, quote, climbed the stairs that led into the living room, and a red-haired girl got up to greet us. She stared at me for a minute and ran back to her friends, yelling, "Dianne is here! Dianne is here!" I was incredibly confused. As far as I knew, we weren't planning to go to the party until the last minute, so I couldn't imagine they were expecting me. The girl returned with 3 other girls, who all took turns hugging me. The red-haired girl, who called herself Lynette, said, "You're even prettier than your picture. Charlie's going to be so happy to meet you." She took my hand and led me to where a bunch of people were sitting in a circle, and in the middle of the floor sat a small man playing the guitar. There were girls surrounding him, singing along to his soulful music of songs I'd never heard before. The girls sat me down and Lynette kept her arms around my shoulder. As soon as the music stopped, she jumped up and pulled me by the hand. "Charlie, we found Dianne. She's here." They weren't just excited, they were overjoyed. It had been ages since I felt truly wanted, and all the attention made me feel like royalty. They were beaming with love, and I felt it. Without hesitation, they sat me in their circle as if I belonged. And strange as it may seem, I felt like I belonged there too. Though tame compared to the later mind control accusations, this is a pretty transparent case of the typical cult tactic of love bombing, and it could very well have had a profound psychological effect on the recently emancipated 14-year-old Dianne Lake. Multiple family members have described the feeling of isolation on the ranch, being detached from the wider society almost completely, down to not knowing the time or day.
By 1968, Manson and about 25 followers were camping out on a ranch north of Los Angeles. They provided care for the 80-year-old owner and his horses in exchange for living space. You don't call it a family, I know, but the group of you, what was the main thing that it was about with all of you?
One day at a time. We played a lot of music, we wrote, we did a lot of things, but we lived today. We lived in the day and the now.
You could absolutely not talk about your past at all. And one thing we didn't have is watches. And the whole idea was to let time disappear. There was no time.
We gave up our birthdays.
What you were seeing is rare footage taken of Manson's followers in 1969. The song is sung by some of Manson's girls. To them, life at the ranch seemed like a game. Liberate yourself, lose yourself in Charlie.
It was so wonderful that it scared us.
You had them thinking you were Jesus Christ. How did you do that?
Just being myself. All men are Jesus Christ.
Sometimes he would reenact the crucifixion when we were on LSD. And it was very realistic.
You mean pretend that he was being nailed?
Yeah, and go through the whole thing. And then make the connections of man, son, son of man, you know. And then the questions would begin. Would you die for me?
Did you ask them to die for you? Would they die?
Sure. That's basic Christian philosophy.
Finally, one night at the ranch, we were all sitting around in our little evening get-together, and he started to say, baa like sheep. And every single one of us did it exactly at the moment that he said.
The whole idea was to let time disappear. There was no time. We were all living now. Now was the only time.
See, at first, the magical mystery tour was that we would be cowboys or gypsies or pirates, and every day it was to wear a different role so that we would get more out of ourselves, and every day was Halloween.
Losing oneself, killing old egos, and replacing them with Manson and his very particular view of the world. It was the serious goal of all that play acting that Manson directed.
If you wipe away somebody's identity, say society is corrupt, forget about everything you ever learned, but then you substitute your own philosophy, it's like wiping the blackboard clean and then introducing your philosophy, and then you become the absolute leader.
Bit by bit, the family became one with Manson.
One of his things was to stop you during the day, and he'd put your palms up to his, and then he'd move them in any direction that he could. Or he'd make a series of faces, and then you were supposed to try to keep up with them. And the whole thing was always geared toward just complete mirroring of him.
The idea was to get rid of all the conditioning, to die in yourself. So he would hold you up and say something to you. Say, see, I can see your mother on you. It's still the conditioning. You know, you haven't gotten rid of it. You're not dead yet.
I would die for you. And then the questions would begin. Would you die for me?
And what was the philosophy that Manson was offering? It had begun with the notion of oneness and the power of love, but over time, it grew steadily more paranoid. The messages to the family grew steadily darker. There was no right or wrong, and life and death were really the same thing. In fact, death could be a welcome step on the way to a better world. And in the fall and winter of 1968, as Manson saw himself more and more a lone visionary, he and the family spent more and more time in a place that only increased their sense of isolation, a remote outpost in Death Valley, Barker Ranch.
We really weren't in touch. We were allowed to listen to the Beatles and the Moody Blues and Manson's music.
The adoption of pseudonyms has also been cited as part of the depersonalization process the family members were subjected to. Tom O'Neill quotes Susan Atkins, saying, "In order for me to be completely free in my mind, I had to be able to completely forget the past. The easiest way to do this is to have to change identity." Now, it is true that Manson created a rainbow-inspired naming scheme for some of his closest female companions, most notably calling Lynette Fromey Red and Sandra Good Blue, but there's a much more mundane explanation for the use of fake identities that O'Neill doesn't mention. The family was constantly engaging in various types of fraud, which required using more than one identity. The warrant application for the Spahn Ranch raid describes credit card fraud and check fraud being committed by multiple family members, and when Manson was handcuffed during the raid, several stolen credit cards fell out of his pockets. And virtually everyone in the family was routinely getting arrested for all kinds of crimes, so skipping bail under the name Sadie Mae Glutz, for instance, would be vastly preferable to having your probation violated as Susan Atkins. The primary killer in the Tate LaBianca murders, Tex Watson, was subjected to psychiatric interviews with clinical psychiatrist Dr. Ira Frank at UCLA in March and April of 1971, long after the prosecution narrative of the murders had solidified, in which he described some of the mind control processes he was supposedly subjected to. "I moved back to the ranch and Manson was pulling on me. I'd given my clothes to Charlie and even part of my mind. He was giving us acid and all. We'd get in a circle, living together, he'd play his guitar, 5 or 6 guys and up to 18 girls. But they were always his girls. He took away their old thoughts from them, and we were told we were perfect. He could always see in our mind, and he could see it all. He persuaded us of it anyway. We'd sit around in a circle, and he would pull all the fear out of our head. We'd be totally electronic. He played like they were imaginary people that had thought and fear, and he'd tell us that they were already dead, and that the only people there were at the ranch. He would play like one of them were sitting in a chair, and cats and dogs in the middle of the circle. He'd pitch them up in the air, and at first it would scare them. Then later it didn't bother them at all. Everything was always perfect, as perfection is. He'd just pull things out of your body, and he'd play his guitar and sing songs. Then he'd place his thoughts in us. Every morning he'd tell us what he wanted us to do that day. The last 3 weeks, he'd give us Benzedrine to keep us awake. And I never did work on things anymore, before the murders happened. Charlie could look into your mind and see your thoughts. If I were to take a knife and kill a girl, would that bother you? He showed us that we could kill without feelings. Obviously, there have been extensive allegations about Manson's use of unconventional sexual practices to control the family, and O'Neill quotes Tex Watson, Paul Watkins, and Dr. David Smith, describing events they claim to have seen or participated in, which I can't describe on YouTube. But in general, they depict a process of using group sex and strange exhibitionism to break down family members' inhibitions and violate taboos. In fact, many of the family members were abnormally sexually liberated to downright dysfunctional by the time they reached the ranch, so it may have been more of a filtering effect at play than any brainwashing. For instance, Steve Clem Grogan was arrested when, by his own telling, something, quote, fell out of his pants in front of a group of children, and he was committed to a psychiatric hospital for observation before escaping and returning to the ranch. Susan Atkins had been a call girl and performed in topless burlesque shows organized by Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan in San Francisco. Bobby Beausoleil and Catherine Gypsy Scher played minor roles in a softcore adult film called Ramrodder. So these were not exactly the most sexually inhibited people on Earth before joining the family. But for our purposes, the most relevant mind control accusations are those related to drugs, specifically LSD.
And they would sit as a group, naked, for countless hours taking acid trips. Manson would pass out the LSD and reinforce his message.
You have not made it yet. You have not made it to become me, because I am the perfect one. And that's basically what all of it was about, was taking on his will.
And how often was the acid?
Well, we took hundreds of trips together, so.
The acid trips were exercises in total control.
With Charlie, he actually did almost like drug programming. I mean, he was the focal point at all times. And what seems so amazing is that he somehow, because acid is a very powerful drug, and it's like I would feel like totally out of control, and yet I would watch him and he would seem totally in control. One of the things, when I look back, I realized I didn't always see him take acid. I don't think he did.
Sometimes he would reenact the crucifixion when we were on LSD, and it was very realistic.
This is how Tom O'Neill describes Manson's acid brainwashing process. Their induction was complete after they participated in lengthy LSD sessions, often stretching over consecutive days with no breaks, during which Manson only pretended to take the drug, or took a much smaller dose. Clear-headed, he manipulated their minds with elaborate word games and sensory techniques he developed in the 2 years since his release from prison. With only negligible downtime between acid trips, detachment was all the easier. Every experience led the family to drift further from reality, until eventually, even basic contradictions seemed tenable. Death was the same as life, good was no different from bad, and God was inseparable from Satan. Paul Watkins believed that Manson wanted to use LSD to instill his philosophies, exploit weaknesses and fears, and extract promises and agreements from his followers. Manson excelled, Watkins said, at locating deep-seated hang-ups. He took up residence in people's heads, leaving them with no point of reference, nothing to relate back to, no right, no wrong, no roots. They lived in a new reality, summoned by LSD, which left them melt-twisted and free of pretension in timeless spirals of movement. Ironically, as his followers became more and more robotic, Manson taught them that people in the straight world were like computers, the family's Brooks Poston wrote. Their worldviews were simply a matter of society's programming, and any program could be expunged. For a family novitiate, the goal was to burn yourself out, to take so much LSD and listen to so much of Charlie's music that you returned to a purity and nothingness resembling a new birth, Tex Watson wrote. This was called going dead in the head, and it let you incorporate into the collective, sharing one common brain. O'Neill quotes Dr. Joel Fort, a research psychiatrist who'd opened the first LSD treatment center in the U.S., saying that Manson had used LSD to produce a new pattern of behavior for the girls, resulting in a totally neutral system which saw death or killing in a completely different way than a normal person sees it, free of social concern, compassion, and moral values. And it turns out that Susan Atkins described this exact type of moral reprogramming through the use of LSD.
Well, you say you're operating from a sense of complete consciousness now and reality. Then looking back from this point for you, what you were and what you did must be terrifying.
Yes, to realize that by my own free will, I willingly got into something that completely took control over me, that I lost control of myself behind drugs and a process of deprogramming, losing my morals.
It wasn't just drugs, it was Charles Manson's persuasiveness too.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of deprogramming that was involved in that. You take away a person's conscience of right and wrong by telling them when they're under LSD or any mind-expanding drug, there's no such thing as guilt. And you've already come to a place in your mind or your imagination where you don't like the feeling of guilt, so it's easy to say, yeah, there's no such thing as guilt. I'll believe there's no such thing as guilt, therefore I can do anything and not feel guilty about it.
But one of the few eyewitness sources we have for the brainwashing narrative that isn't tainted by parole concerns comes from Paul Watkins, a musician who lived with the family for a period along with his friend Brooks Poston. Watkins did testify for the prosecution during the trial, and he published a book and attended speaking events with Bugliosi for decades afterwards, so he was incentivized to affirm the prosecution narrative, albeit to a lesser extent than the others. This is how Watkins described the brainwashing process years later in his book, My Life with Charles Manson. The evening ritual was always the same. We'd eat dinner, listen to Charlie rap for an hour or two, play music together, then make love, either in small groups or as a family. Once or twice a week, we'd set aside an evening to take acid. Use of drugs in the family was never indiscriminate or casual. Rarely did we smoke grass during the day, and Charlie forbade anyone taking acid on his own. Drugs were used for a specific purpose, to bring us into a higher state of consciousness as a family, to unify us. Basically, Charlie's trip was to program us all to submit, to give up our egos. Charlie was always rapping about letting go of the ego. Let it die, turn off the internal dialogue, and come to now. We don't have to be hung up on all this past shit. Let it die. It doesn't matter what happened to you when you were 3 years old or when you joined the Boy Scouts. There's nothing to figure out. There ain't no background. There's just now, and when we come to now, we come to love and get free. After these spiels, we'd sing Charlie's songs which reinforced his words. Cease to exist, your home is where you're happy, and old ego is a too much thing. Then a few of the girls would pass around some grass or a little hash, and Charlie would initiate a game called the Circle, transmitting motion by joining hands and passing the motion around the group. We'd all focus on turning off the internal dialogue and just get into the rhythm and vibrations of the motion. Charlie was always rapping about making love and death. Those words went together, flowed effusively through all his songs and raps. In time, death and making love became almost synonymous. It's through ego death that we come to love. Like everyone else, I was going through my changes, trying to become one with my love. And Charlie was love. I was in some sense, like everyone else, becoming Charlie. Not infrequently, during some heavy acid trip, someone would shout, "But who am I? I don't know who to be." Charlie would just tell them not to worry about it. Be whoever or whatever you want to be. If you want to be someone, why not be me? One evening at Spahn Ranch, Charlie and I took a hike up to the outlaw shacks before dinner and sat on the porch. He told me how he envisioned the family once people got the shit and the ego mucked out of them, once they got clear. It's like when people are really tuned into each other, they don't have to think or speak, they just know. One thought becomes all thought. They move together, they feel together, they breathe together like one organism. In a way, they become more like animals, more instinctive. They don't worry about the shit in their heads. They're clear. They just react and feel. Then, whatever they do is right on. Making love, making music, just getting into the flow of the natural scene. The idea is to kill off all the programs society's stuck us with, to deprogram ourselves, to get rid of the past shit, to submit to the love and come to now. That's why we sing and make love together and see our fears for what they are, steps to a higher consciousness. It's like the man on the cross. He just loved. He just submitted to his love, and all his body carried was love. There were no programs inside him. He was clear, just a hole in the infinite that love poured out of. Charlie would often refer to himself as a hole in the infinite. The implications were obvious, and I remember Dianne Lake's comment the first day I came to Spahn's. Charlie is Jesus Christ. It was all the more intriguing and compelling because Charlie was never Christ-like in any traditional classical sense. Turn the other cheek, stuff like that. Maybe that made it easier to buy. It seemed more real, more plausible. Obviously, these aren't verbatim quotes. They're based on Watkins' years-old recollections, but many of the themes would be familiar to anyone who's listened to enough Charles Manson interviews. The exact timeline is fuzzy, but Watkins maintained that he'd separated from the family during the period leading up to the murders. The way Watkins told it, he and Brooks Poston met a grizzled old prospector named Paul Crockett who'd been looking for gold near the ranch, who deprogrammed them from Charlie's mind control. Watkins gives only a cursory account of his deprogramming in his book, but when he was asked about the process on CNN decades later, this was how he described it.
Well, now, I've got to ask you this, because judging from everything we've read over the years, if you were rather important in the organization, how did you get away?
Well, that wasn't easy. I ran off to the hideout that we had in Death Valley and just started thinking about it. I met an old man there that started talking some sense to me. It wasn't that he lectured me so much and talked me out of what I was in, but he just started asking me questions that really made me reassess what I was doing. He would ask me things like, you really believe all that crap? And he would make me think about what I was doing. And I quit using marijuana and the substances that I was using at that time and began to think more clearly.
Maybe Watkins' memory had just faded with time, but if the mind control could be reversed just by asking, do you really believe that? How strong could it have been? And in fact, Watkins temporarily returned to the family after his alleged deprogramming, and even attended the trials alongside other family members before he was called to testify. But the most important pieces of evidence we have on the subject of Manson's brainwashing are probably the recorded interviews that both Paul Crockett and Paul Watkins' friend, Brooks Poston, gave to Inyo County Police on October 3, 1969, which you can listen to on the Cielo Drive YouTube channel. Crucially, these interviews were recorded over a month before Susan Atkins' cellmate, Ronnie Howard, called the LAPD with information about Atkins' jailhouse confession on November 17th, the event which set in motion the prosecution's construction of the official narrative. So the information in these interviews is totally untainted by parole concerns, other witness testimony, or Vincent Bugliosi's tampering. Crockett tells the interviewer that when people from the ranch first told him about Manson, he couldn't believe what they were saying. It was so utterly ridiculous, I thought they were nuts. No man could possibly be doing the things he was talking about. Crockett doesn't elaborate on this point, but in his interview, Brooks Poston says that after knowing him for only a short time, he came to believe that Charles Manson was Jesus Christ, and that a biblical Armageddon was imminent, during which the family would disappear into a hole in the desert. According to Poston, Manson taught that there was no such thing as sin or crime, and frequently talked people into giving him expensive items, including cars, credit cards, and money. Manson would also tell people about how he had, quote, died on the cross for you once before, and had tried to convince Poston to murder a local sheriff. According to Paul Crockett, by the time of the interview, he'd deprogrammed 3 family members, Paul Watkins, Brooks Poston, and Juan Flynn, which so enraged Manson that he told Crockett to his face that he was planning to kill him. Crockett talks about an incident where Manson had held a knife to Juan Flynn's throat and demanded he do whatever Manson said, including car theft, SA, and murder. In the same interview, Brooks Poston talks about how Manson had been using the lyrics of his songs to program the people on the ranch. And Crockett uses the same term, saying he didn't think it was possible to program people the way Manson had. Notably, Crockett says that Manson claimed to be in communication with black Muslims and other black radical groups who were stockpiling weapons and explosives for use in some kind of imminent racial violence. He also quotes Manson as saying Helter Skelter's coming down. These interviews are significant for a number of reasons. First, they prove that the talk of Helter Skelter and paranoia about an impending race war on the ranch wasn't an invention of the prosecution, as some writers have claimed. Second, they show that even an untrained observer like Crockett, who'd only been in that environment for a few weeks, recognized that Manson was subjecting the family to some kind of mind control and demanding that they commit illegal acts and violence at his command. And third, they demonstrate that the family's conception of itself and its relationship to Manson was indeed religious, at least by that point, and that Manson was viewed by some of them as a kind of messiah figure. This is especially problematic for those who insist that the family was just a commune or group marriage, but not a cult, or that nothing resembling brainwashing happened on the ranch. Does any of this sound similar to the research Jolly West was conducting for the CIA? Well, I think we can safely rule out creating unknowing couriers and extracting information using drugs and hypnosis right off the bat. All the talk about forgetting your past and coming to now could be interpreted as a kind of amnesia, but Manson was encouraging the family to do this voluntarily, not inflicting it on them without their knowledge. Manson definitely seemed to be inducing something like insanity in his followers, encouraging the development of paranoid and delusional beliefs, and the group music and sex sessions could easily be interpreted as a kind of trance state. The most obvious parallel with West's work, however, would seem to be Manson's ability to transform his followers' belief systems, turning their relatively normal, middle-class morality into the convict code, the love-death conflation, and the constant violation of taboos. How much of this reprogramming was consensual and how much was manipulation is harder to say. But however similar or dissimilar you find Manson and West's mind control techniques to be, ultimately there's no evidence that Manson ever met Jolly West, and, at least as of 2026, there's no evidence in the public record to indicate that any of the prisons where Manson was held before his 1967 release were being used as MKUltra test sites either. So if there is indeed a direct connection between Manson and MKUltra, it has yet to be discovered. But for all his focus on the group's dynamics, O'Neill spends remarkably little time analyzing Manson's own perception of the family and his relationship to it. Obviously, Manson had long disclaimed the title of hippie cult leader, but it turns out that in 2014, a Croatian journalist actually put the MKUltra question to Manson himself. There are rumors that Charles Manson was involved with the MKUltra programs and also Phoenix programs through prisons. Manson's reply? The what programs? I don't even know what that is. And predictably, Manson's own explanation for how he acquired such influence over the family is a lot more mundane than O'Neill's version of the story. Manson was charismatic, musically talented, and socially connected to some of the most famous and glamorous people in the entertainment industry of the late 60s. And you have to imagine, this is when there were only 4 TV channels, before the internet and its infinite niche subcultures, when teenagers went into fits of literal hysteria when they saw Elvis or the Beatles in person. And at the same time, large swaths of the entertainment industry were playing footsies with the counterculture and radical politics, and talk of revolution and the plastic pigs of mainstream American life was absolutely mundane. In these entertainment circles, Manson was perceived as above all authentic, in contrast to typical show business phonies. Here was a real ex-con who seemed to live by his own mystical, quasi-religious code, and actually rejected materialism on a practical level, who kissed Dennis Wilson's feet and famously gave away the keys to his bus just because someone asked. Manson was seen to be actually practicing the radical ethos that these bigger acts just flirted with. This attracted both devotees, like Dennis Wilson, who viewed Manson as a guru, and groupies, who liked the social status and glamour that an association with Manson brought. And this is a theme that Manson returned to repeatedly over the years when interviewers described the family as a cult. He would frequently mention Jerry Rubin and the Yippies, a famous countercultural performance art group, who in books and speeches spoke of killing one's own parents as a revolutionary act. Manson's position was, I didn't write those songs about revolution. I'm not the one who told the children to go kill their parents. I just happen to have friends who took all that rhetoric seriously, and now you want to turn around and blame me?
I want to know how you feel about the fact that you were the stuff of a nation's nightmare. For years, you were the personification of everything evil, everything rotten in this country.
Yeah, you dumped it all off on me. I was your goat.
We believe in symbols.
Jerry Rubin, A.B. Hoffman didn't do a day, but they were the ones that were saying, raise up and kill your mom and dad, kids.
They weren't saying that.
Don't tell me he didn't take an M16 in Chicago 7 and jump up and tell the kids to go kill their moms and dads.
He didn't say that.
Yes, he did. I read it in the paper.
Oh, you believe the paper?
You see what I'm saying?
So are you saying that the murders of Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas was a political act?
My goodness, man. And did you see Jerry Rubin stand up in the TV camera with an M16 and say, raise up children, kill your moms and dads? You didn't see that? You don't remember that?
Sure.
Well, you didn't put him on trial. You got Charlie Manson and put Charlie Manson on trial. Did you hear A.B. Hoffman go through all the colleges and give all the speeches to all the young minds about how to shoot cocaine, how to deal with your dope, and how to play in that underworld? And then at the same time, he never spent 3 days in jail. He owns the judge. He buys and sells judges. And he rides on the top of you children. You know, and then you got A.B. Hoffman that acts like, oh, well, we're with you kids. All right, you kids, you go do this. And then the kids run and do it. And then who gets the blame? You know, the kids get the blame.
In various abstract ways, Manson argued that the real brainwashing in his case happened through pop cultural influences, but the family suffered the consequences because they were the only ones naive, ballsy, or desperate enough to actually act on the revolutionary, militaristic rhetoric that everyone in their milieu seemed to be spouting.
You got little crimes, you lock people up in jail, but you got the big people that are pushing all the little people. You got people that are leading you into captivity by saying, take a knife and change your clothes and go kill your mom and dad.
And a bunch of kids raise up and they go kill their moms and dads, and then they say, oh, we all got haircuts and we're living in Wall Street. We didn't grow up. They didn't do no time. Jerry Rubin, A.B. Hoffman, they didn't do no time. Jane Fonda and Joan Baez, they didn't do no time. But they're awful quick to jump up and say, hey, kids, why don't we go over and do this? Hey, kids, why don't we go and do that? We blame Charlie for it, and it's all right, see? But crime comes into the living rooms of everyone.
There's also the argument that rather than framing Manson's relationship with the family in terms of brainwashing, his level of control over them could be more accurately understood as a case of pimping and human trafficking, especially when it came to the women in his thrall.
And the tales of the nightly group sex.
And there was at times basically group sex, but it was always very planned because it was a means of control. When he'd have different men that he was trying to initiate into the family, try to bring them in, he would offer them whatever women he had.
If a man wanted you, you went with him. You couldn't resist.
He was an excellent pimp.
One of the things that the women have said is that you used them as bait for the men.
Isn't that what women do? Isn't that what women's for? Women receive men and reflect men. Man hold dominion up over woman. It's been that way since we grunted and we came out of caves.
Manson was an experienced pimp in his mid-30s, exploiting girls in their mid-teens to early 20s, who often came into his orbit as runaways or orphans, escaping difficult circumstances. He kept the women in a state of domestic and sexual servitude, beating them and expecting them to engage in free love with others at his command. Many of the female family members earnestly believed that they were in a polygamous marriage with Manson. For example, Patricia Krenwinkel has spoken about her delusional belief that after the murders, she and Manson would settle down and have children. The author Nikolas Schreck has said that over their decades-long relationship, he never heard Manson express remorse for the murders because he genuinely didn't feel responsible for them. But he did talk about his regret over the way he treated the women he had pimped out. And notably, Manson always claimed that when he first saw the killers after the murders at the Tate house, his first reaction was bitter anger and frustration rather than pride or approval.
Susan Atkins come home to you, bloody hands.
Yeah.
She says, Charlie, look what I did for you.
Yeah. So I give you the world.
I
just killed myself and I give you the world.
So, how'd you react?
I say, you dumb fucking cunt, I already had the world. You just put me back in jail again.
How'd she react?
How did she react? Susie followed me around and she was always trouble. She would steal, she would lie, she'd do all kinds of crazy things.
So if Manson wasn't expecting the family to go out and murder 5 people on August 8th, 1969, then what did he think they were going to do? Special thanks to my channel members for making this video possible. What you're watching is the product of literally hundreds of hours of research, writing, and video editing work. The YouTube algorithm has almost completely stopped recommending my channel to new people. If you want to see more deep dives like this, please consider becoming a member, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe so I can keep this channel going. Whether you accept that Manson was using MKUltra brainwashing tactics on his followers or not, the issue of motive is its own separate question and just as mysterious. In Chaos, O'Neill seems to imply that the murders were a result of Operation Chaos or some other CIA program charged with making the counterculture of the 1960s look bad. O'Neill never explains the exact mechanism by which he thinks this happened, but an analysis of the evidence should help us determine where and how this interference might have occurred, and if it was even necessary to produce the crimes in the first place. And ironically, the event which actually kicked off the family's spate of killings receives very little attention in Chaos. This is how O'Neill describes it. On July 1, 1969, during a dispute over drug money in a Hollywood apartment, Manson shot Bernard Lotzapapa Crow, a black drug dealer. According to Helter Skelter, the dealer had told Manson that he was a Panther and that his brothers would come and get Manson at the ranch if he didn't pay up. Manson shot Crow in the chest and fled the scene, believing he'd killed the dealer. Now, you wouldn't know this from O'Neill's version, but that dispute over drug money actually involved Tex Watson, not Manson or the rest of the family. In reality, Watson had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman named Rosina Kroner, and both of them were involved in the narcotics trade in LA. Watson felt that Kroner had ripped him off on a prior drug deal and concocted a scheme to get his money back. He told Kroner that he could get a good deal on a large quantity of marijuana, so long as his purchase was over a specific dollar amount, but he needed someone else to put in money to buy enough to get the discount. Believing the offer was legitimate, Kroner recruited a well-known LA drug dealer named Bernard Crow, who went by the street name Lotsapapa, to throw in a few $1,000s on the deal. After collecting the money, Crow drove Watson to the building where he said his dealer lived, and Tex walked in the front door, ran out the back, and returned to Spahn Ranch with the $5,000 or so he'd stolen from Crow and Kroner. When he realized that Watson wasn't coming back, an infuriated Crow took Rosina Kroner hostage, intending to ransom her for the return of his money. Crow placed a call to Spahn Ranch, the last place Kroner knew Tex Watson had been living. But Watson had already skipped town, telling everyone on the ranch he was going camping, neglecting to mention the money he'd just stolen. When family member T.J. Walliman answered the call, Crow asked for Charles, Tex Watson's real first name, but Walliman put Manson on the phone. Crow started demanding his money back and threatened to kill Kroner if he didn't get it. When that didn't work, he told Manson he was a Black Panther and that he was going to pick up some brothers and come kill everyone on the ranch if he wasn't reimbursed. Fearing the threat was legitimate, Manson grabbed the buntline revolver, which would later be used in the Cielo Drive murders, and drove to Crow's apartment, with family member and Vietnam veteran T.J. Walliman at his side. This is Walliman's account of the confrontation.
TJ was with Charlie when he blew open the chest with a .22 caliber gun of Bernard Crow.
Don't be
so you have seen him do violence.
Bill, you sat there and listened to the reasons for that, and if you were in the same position...
Wait, TJ, you admit you saw Charlie shoot a man in the chest?
Sure I did. I also seen everything else that happened. The guy called up and says he's going to cut this girl's head off. And come in, because Tex
wasn't this a drug deal that went bad?
Tex stole the money, and then Tex comes back with this money after and leaves his fiancee there to get her head cut off, and says I'm going camping, and we didn't know that until the phone call came. They asked
how far away was the guy when Charlie pulled the trigger?
You want to hear it or not?
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, okay. We went there because there was a screaming, crying girl there that said they were going to kill this girl, and we heard it on the phone because there was two phones. She asked for Charlie. Tex's name was Charlie, so I got the other Charlie because I didn't know him as Charlie. I knew him as Tex. When we got there, they had her tied up on the bed, and we got her out of there. And the only reason anybody got shot after Charlie got down on his knees and put the gun in his hand and handed it to the guy, he says, if you got to take a life, take mine. The guy laughed and says, it has to be the girl.
So then Charlie shot him?
That's after he...
I know, but then he shot him.
Yeah, with empty rounds.
Why did he shoot him, Bill, or did he not shoot him?
Sure, he shot him once in the chest.
But Chaos doesn't mention any of this, and instead portrays the Bernard Crow incident as a confrontation between Manson and Crow over some unspecified drug money. And here's our first problem with the Chaos narrative of the crimes. If Manson had brainwashed everyone on the ranch to start a race war on his behalf, why was Manson the one who had to shoot the supposed Black Panther Bernard Crow? Especially when the whole ordeal was over Tex Watson's money, not Manson's. Isn't that exactly the kind of thing Manson should have been having other family members do, according to the mind control theory? In his 20 years of research, O'Neill certainly would have learned about Rosina Kroner's role in the incident. He even mentions that Tex Watson's girlfriend witnessed the shooting, so why omit Tex Watson's involvement completely? Manson's belief that Crow was a Black Panther is certainly relevant when it comes to the family's growing obsession with an impending race war, but it's not the whole story. Crow was shot on July 1, 1969, but according to testimony from Brooks Poston and Paul Watkins during the trial, Manson's racial paranoia had already started to intensify by the beginning of 1969. There's been lots of speculation about what exactly precipitated the sudden uptick in Manson's race war fixation, but the warrant application for the Spahn Ranch raid quotes an LAPD officer named Ted Lee saying that he had heard, presumably from an informant on the ranch, that 3 carloads of Black Panthers had been at Spahn Ranch surveying the area and taking photos in late July of 1969, just days before the Tate LaBianca murders. The same officer said that he'd been told that the Panthers were there to plan for an attack on the ranch in retaliation not for the Bernard Crow shooting, but rather for an incident which had supposedly happened in the Venice area on April 20th, 1969, which is referred to in police documents as the Venice Riot. According to Lee, the Venice Riot was a large fight/race riot which had kicked off on Venice Beach when a black man's ear was bitten off by a white biker. An informant told Lee that, apparently in response to the riot, various biker gangs, including the Hells Angels and the Satan Slaves, were gathering on the ranch and arming themselves in preparation for an imminent gang war. I looked extensively, but I was unable to find any news articles about this Venice riot, or determine how the family was supposed to be connected to it, but it appears that this was just one of the many rumors regarding the Black Panthers that was circulating on the ranch in the lead-up to the murders. The same warrant application refers to an interview with a woman who lived on a ranch right next to Spahn's named Judy Green, who claimed that she'd been threatened by numerous black militants because she'd reported them to the fire department for putting their own lock on a fire road gate adjacent to her property. Obviously, Manson's race war obsession alone isn't enough to explain why police were getting independent reports about a race riot in Venice and accounts from disinterested third parties like Judy Green about interactions with black militants in the area of Spahn Ranch. These details are especially significant for the chaos narrative of the murders. The most plausible version of O'Neill's thesis is that the CIA wasn't directly orchestrating the family's actions, but rather covertly nudged Manson in the direction of violence by feeding into his racial paranoia. But it seems highly unlikely that the CIA was behind the racist biker riot, the drug burn, or the conflict between George Spahn's neighbors and random black militants, which actually precipitated Manson's growing fixation on racial violence and the Panthers. There were two other developments during the midsummer of 1969 that have important implications for understanding the motive. First, Terry Melcher, a famous record producer and close friend of Dennis Wilson, introduced the family to a musician and recording engineer named Mike Deasy. Melcher had long believed that Manson's appeal as a performer couldn't be reduced to studio recordings of his music, and that the commercial presentation of Manson needed to be something that could capture his charismatic beatnik vibe, his philosophy, lifestyle, and his relationship with the family. To this end, Melcher brought Mike Deasy and his mobile recording studio to the ranch so they could record Manson and the family in their natural habitat, to hopefully capture a sense of the family's spontaneity and communal improvisation that Melcher so admired. Deasy returned to the ranch multiple times that summer to try to get better recordings of Manson's songs. But on June 6, they had a confrontation which remained a source of resentment for Manson for decades afterward. There are only bits and pieces of what actually happened, scattered throughout various sources, but essentially, Deasy had an LSD freakout during which he saw Manson as the devil and became physically violent, attacking various family members and threatening Manson with some kind of weapon, usually identified as a pitchfork. He was eventually subdued and left, but Manson came to blame Terry Melcher for the incident. And whenever Manson was asked about the motive for Tate LaBianca during his incarceration, he would frequently make oblique references to this confrontation, implying that the motive was somehow related to the grudges some family members held against Melcher after the incident. In Manson's coded references to this event in interviews, he would refer to Mike Deasy as the Oriental.
The guy comes up to me and he says, "You're God, you must be him." I said, "Get away from me with that."
Who said that?
He said,
"Who said that?"
"That the Oriental."
Who's that?
Said,
Who's that? Who's the Oriental? What's it? Do you remember his name?
"This is my music, you little bitch.
Yeah.
I'll take your heart out of your chest, tramp. Right when I come over to you. Okay. You dig?" He said, "What are you doing on your plan?" Melcher sent this clown over to me.
So, it's got something to do with Terry Melcher?
Yeah, no, he came, he wanted to fight. I told him I don't want to fight. I said, "Bruce, you want to fight this guy? You fight him. I'm not going to fight him." I ducked him and ran behind the barn. I don't want to fight him. So Bruce was getting ready to fight him. Somebody else was fighting him. He was fighting everybody else. You dig what I'm saying? Then he come to fight me, and I got one of the things that then I put over his head, and I lay him down. And I said, you want me to cut your head off? I'll take your life now. You know, and I got him right up to the point of taking his life right now, and I said, "Look, man, I don't want to go to death row for you. I don't want to go to San Quentin for you." He said, "Stay out of the music or cut my head off." I said, "Go back to your wife and get under her bed and beg her for forgiveness." I and I kicked, and I ran him off. But when I ran him off, everybody else is still in the war.
The second important event from that summer was Bobby Beausoleil selling a batch of mescaline to a motorcycle gang called the Straight Satans. Bobby Beausoleil was a relatively successful musician who sometimes played guitar with Manson and had been a founding member of the group that became the famous 1960s band Love. Beausoleil had also been associated with the avant-garde filmmaker Kenneth Anger in San Francisco and was deeply involved in the countercultural music scene in Los Angeles. Beausoleil had first met Manson in 1968 through the musician and UCLA doctoral student Gary Hinman, and although they were friends and played music together, Beausoleil never actually considered himself a member of the family, viewing Manson more as a peer and a talented musician than as a leader. Besides being a doctoral student, Gary Hinman was active in radical politics and the LA music scene, and was so close with Manson that at one point, Manson gave his parole officer Gary Hinman's address and phone number as his sole point of contact, and family members routinely slept in Hinman's apartment when they were in LA. And while Hinman wasn't really a professional drug dealer, he did sell drugs on the side as a means of income while teaching music lessons and studying for his PhD. During the summer of 1969, Manson had been inviting members of motorcycle gangs to the ranch, most notably a group called the Straight Satans. The exact rationale for this association isn't clear, but the Spahn Ranch warrant application says members of the Straight Satans were stationed as guards around the ranch, apparently for protection from the Black Panthers, and the bikers enjoyed the easy access to women that the family provided. Some family members, like Dianne Lake, have claimed that the introduction of the biker element was a significant turning point for the family when things became darker and more paranoid, and the group began drinking and dabbling in harder drugs, especially speed, whereas before they'd confined themselves mostly to weed and hallucinogens. A Straight Satans member named Danny DiCarlo also started bringing weapons, including guns and swords, to the ranch. But in terms of the murders, the real precipitating event came when the Straight Satans purchased a batch of mescaline from Bobby Beausoleil, which they intended to use during a 10-year anniversary party for the club in Venice. After the party, the Straight Satans went back to Beausoleil, demanding their money back, complaining that the mescaline he'd sold them had made the club members sick and threatening his life if they weren't reimbursed. This backstory didn't come out until years after Beausoleil's trial, which was separate from the rest of the families, but both Beausoleil and Manson substantially agreed on this version of events in later interviews over decades. The way Beausoleil tells it, he went to Gary Hinman's house on July 25, 1969, with the intention of getting his money back, not killing him. And he claims that the women he brought with him, Susan Atkins and Mary Bruner, didn't even know about the mescaline deal, and were expecting a friendly visit with Hinman. Beausoleil's story is that he asked for the money back, but Hinman said there was nothing wrong with the mescaline, and he didn't have the money anymore anyway. As the conflict escalated, Beausoleil pulled out a gun and threatened Hinman with it. The two struggled over the gun, causing an accidental discharge, but eventually Beausoleil prevailed, and Hinman agreed to sign over 2 cars to him as repayment for the mescaline. However, unbeknownst to Beausoleil, during the struggle over the gun, one of the women he'd brought along had called the ranch and told Manson that Gary had gotten the gun away from Bobby. So at this point, according to Beausoleil, the conflict was essentially over. Beausoleil had the pink slips for the 2 cars, and the 4 of them, Gary Hinman, Susan Atkins, Mary Bruner, and Bobby Beausoleil, were just hanging out in Hinman's apartment. This is Beausoleil's account of what happened next.
So I got him to sign over the pink slips, and we called it good. I apologized to Gary for roughening him up and for invading. I felt terrible about it. I was going there to rob him, basically, but I didn't want to. I just felt that I had to. And so I'm getting ready to leave at this point, and suddenly Charlie, with Bruce standing behind him, show up at the front door. And, at this point, Gary is just walking around like normal. He's, we've settled everything. There wasn't any, we weren't going to take it any further. It wasn't going to be any more of a problem than than to just leave. That's all I needed to do was to leave, but I didn't get a chance. Charlie came to the door, and Gary, which would have looked like like indeed Gary had the gun when he went to the door himself, the front door, and opened the door for Charlie and said, "Hi, Charlie." And Charlie walked into the door, slashed Gary's face with this little sawed-off, this little weapon that he'd been given by a member of the Straight Satans. You know, it was a broken sword blade, maybe about a foot long, that had a handmade buccaneer handle welded to it, made by one of the bikers in the Straight Satans. And Charlie came in, and this was his weapon, and he immediately slashed Gary across the face with it, on his cheek. I think he was actually aiming at Gary's throat, but he's so short in stature that the angle was high, and it hit him in the cheek instead. And I said, "Charlie, why did you do that?" And Charlie said, "To show you how to be a man." He thought that Gary had the gun. Bruce walks in the door, and it's Bruce's gun. Bruce walks in the door and confronts Gary, who's holding his hand up to his cheek. A little trickle of blood coming through his fingers. And he confronts Gary and says, "Where's the gun?" And Gary just looks at him stupidly. He didn't know what to say, you know. And I stepped forward and I said, "I have it." So I took the gun out of my belt and gave it to Bruce. But anyway, that's the situation that led to me killing Gary, because after sitting with Gary overnight, and most of the next day, trying to mollify him, trying to figure out some kind of way to make it all right that he had a cut on his face. And at times it's okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to heal, but then in other times, no, I want to go to the hospital. And I was terrified of him going to the hospital, because I knew that meant he would bring the cops into it, and my life would be over in my mind. If he went to the emergency room, if I just left, he would call the police, or he would call an ambulance. Either way, he would bring in the police. So, to cut to the chase, to make a long story short, I killed him to save my own ass.
There are conflicting stories regarding exactly how much Atkins and Brunner participated in the murder, but Hinman ultimately succumbed to a series of stab wounds inflicted by Beausoleil. Knowing that Hinman had been involved in radical politics, Beausoleil left a paw print, a symbol associated with the Black Panthers, and the words "political piggy" written in blood inside Hinman's apartment, in an attempt to make it look like Hinman had been murdered as a result of his activism. On August 6th, just 2 days before the Tate LaBianca murders, the police would find Beausoleil sleeping on the side of the highway in one of Hinman's cars, with the murder weapon still hidden in the wheel well, and arrested him on the spot. This is the version of events that both Manson and Beausoleil gave in interviews over several decades, even though it was in neither man's best interest to do so. Manson was never prosecuted for Hinman's murder, so confessing his participation put him at risk of more charges. And for Beausoleil, the mescaline story drastically conflicts with the prosecution narrative he was convicted under at trial, so making these disclosures significantly hinders his prospects for parole. If anything, Beausoleil would be much better off saying he was brainwashed by Manson into killing Hinman. But what does chaos say about Gary Hinman's murder? In July 1969, the increasingly agitated Manson was convinced that Hinman had just come into an inheritance of some $20,000. Seeing green, he ordered 3 of his followers, Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins, the last of whom would later participate in the Tate LaBianca murders, to seize Hinman's money by any means necessary. The 3 showed up at Hinman's on July 25. Manson was wrong, he said. There was no inheritance, but they refused to take him at his word. They tied him up and ransacked the place, but there was no cash to be found. Manson decided to see for himself, coming over with Bruce Davis, another family member. But even Manson couldn't extract anything from Hinman. Finally, incensed, Manson drew a saber from a sheath on his belt and cut Hinman's ear in half. He and Davis left the house, but he told Beausoleil and the girls to stay until they found the money. For 2 days, they battered and tortured Hinman, who insisted he had no inheritance. They also sewed up his severed ear using dental floss. By day 3, Manson had had enough. He wanted Hinman dead. Over the phone, he ordered his followers to take care of it. Beausoleil tied Hinman up and stabbed him at least 4 times. As Hinman incanted a Buddhist prayer, Atkins and Brunner took turns holding a pillow over his face until he stopped breathing. Just as Manson would do in the Tate-LaBianca murders, he told his followers to leave signs implicating the Black Panthers. They dipped a rag in Hinman's blood and smeared the words "political piggy" on the living room wall, surrounding it with bloody paw prints. Now, O'Neill certainly knew about the mescaline deal and the Straight Satan's connection, but rather than including these obviously relevant details, he reiterates the prosecution's narrative about Hinman's non-existent inheritance and has Manson ordering Hinman's murder and telling his followers to leave signs. This is strange for 3 reasons. First, why would Manson and Beausoleil spend 40 years telling convergent stories about a mescaline deal that makes both of them look even worse just to cover up a murder over this imaginary inheritance? Does O'Neill think they're just lying? And if so, what could possibly be their motive? Second, if this is really a case of Manson ordering his followers to rob and murder Gary Hinman on his behalf, why did Manson show up in the middle of the operation? Just like with the Crow shooting, why is Manson needlessly inserting himself into the crime when his Manchurian candidate killers are supposedly already in the process of carrying it out for him? And third, O'Neill quotes multiple cops who worked on the Tate-LaBianca case, saying that on August 8th, the day after he was booked, Beausoleil called Spahn Ranch and told the person on the other end, allegedly Linda Kasabian, that he'd been arrested for Hinman's murder. "I need help," he was heard telling her. "Leave a sign." But if Beausoleil had only left the paw prints and writing in blood in Hinman's apartment because Manson told him to, then why would Beausoleil need to tell the family to leave a sign? The writing was all Manson's idea anyway, according to O'Neill. Why would Beausoleil care specifically about leaving a sign? O'Neill uncovered new evidence suggesting that Beausoleil's jailhouse phone call to the ranch had been recorded by police, but the existence of the call, and the fact that Linda Kasabian was the one who answered it, was actually reported decades earlier in Manson in his own words, a book based partially on admissions Manson had made to the book's author, Nuel Emmons, over the course of years they spent incarcerated together. After the section about Beausoleil's phone call, Emmons quotes Manson saying, "As a group, Leslie Van Houten, Mary Brunner, Lynette Fromey, Susan Atkins, and Linda Kasabian informed me of Bobby's arrest. Linda repeated the phone conversation with Bobby, the charges, and what he had told the police. At present, he was being held as a suspect and hadn't been charged with murder. After the phone call, the girls had held their own meeting and discussed the best method of assisting Bobby. They decided that if murders similar to the Hinman slaying continued to occur, the police would begin to believe Bobby wasn't their man. They hadn't got as far as figuring out who was going to do these copycat killings or who would be the victims. I told him the plan was crazy and that the police wouldn't go for it. Susan Atkins blurted out, "It will work, Charlie. At Gary's house, we wrote things on the wall like political piggy and drew a panther's paw and that kind of stuff. We can do it again and they'll think black people did it. It'll be Helter Skelter." This is what's known as the love of brother theory of the crimes. The idea that the Tate-LaBianca murders were the result of the Manson girls' poorly thought out scheme to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail by committing copycat crimes.
Here's the conversation. Indian Mesa. We got 4 campfires. We got 4 queens on a motorcycle gang, a motorcycle group that rides SS motorcycles out of Venice, Santa Monica. So we're riding motorcycles and we're all up there and we got these fires going and we got this big problem that came up. I had to go shoot somebody for text. Bobby's in the prison. My brother's in jail. Now, understand my mind, all my life I've been in jail because I didn't have no one to get me out of jail. I didn't have no brother outside. So I spent years and years and years and years just because nobody would come and sign their name and get me out of jail. And the jail couldn't let me out because I didn't have no place to go. So I spent 22 years in prison because I didn't have nobody outside. I can't let somebody that's with me stay in jail. It just ain't, you know, it's not in my makeup, man. I got to get my brother out of jail.
So you needed money to do that?
Well, here's the division between your mind and my mind. Here's where the chamber opens up. When you get in trouble, you go to your mother. You call up mother. I ain't got no mother to call. When you go to the bank, draw some money, pay a lawyer. I ain't got no money. I can't go to no lawyer. I go to a lawyer, I ain't got enough money. I got a little money, and anytime anybody knows anything about lawyers, when you got a little money, they're just taking that. They'll take the little money and let you sue them in court, you dig? In other words, like, I don't have enough money to go to the lawyer to get Bobby out. So everybody's standing around, and I said, pay me. Pay me what you owe me, now. And they said, well, how do we do that? I said, get my brother out of jail. And he said, how do we do it? I said, I don't know how you do it. I don't care how you do it. Do it, now. Do it. And they said, how do we do it? I said, don't ask me how to do it. I don't want to be no part of no conspiracy. But however you do it and get it done now. And they said, well, we don't know what to do. We'll get a lawyer. And then, here, Leslie and Patty, they said, if we get a lawyer, all they're going to do is lie and take our money anyway.
So Tex, you did one for Tex? Tex, it's time for you to do what? Got to pay me back.
I got to pay the brother back.
Okay, so what did Tex do? What happened?
So Tex went to pay the brother back. When he went to pay the brother back to get Bobby back out of jail, you dig what I'm saying? They said, we'll go get a lawyer. And they said, get a fucking lawyer for what? All the lawyers do is lie and take the money, you know? Lawyers are not doing anything but for themselves, you dig? So they said, well, we'll make the murders keep on like looking like it was keep on keeping on. You dig what I'm saying?
In Chaos, O'Neill admits that the cops who investigated Tate LaBianca and some of the prosecutors, besides Bugliosi, believed this was the real motive. And in interviews over decades, multiple members of the family, and Manson himself, have insisted this was why the Tate LaBianca murders happened. But as discussed in the beginning of the video, this is just one of the 3 primary motives which have been proposed as alternatives to the Helter-Skelter motive. There's the drug burn theory, where the Tate LaBianca murders were just the most violent of a series of drug-related robberies committed by Tex Watson. And then there's the chaos theory, where the murders at the Tate residence, seemingly in isolation, were a result of some kind of CIA operation related to MKUltra and Operation Chaos, in an elaborate plot to undermine the counterculture and the anti-war movement. And for this next part, I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with the basics of the Tate and LaBianca murders, so we can examine some of the lesser-known facts in a theory-agnostic way, and you can decide which motive, if any, fits the data best. Let's start with the victims. There were 5 people at the house on Cielo Drive who would end up dead on the night of August 8, 1969. Abigail Folger, Sharon Tate, Wojtek Frykowski, Jay Sebring, and Stephen Parent. Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, was a socialite who dabbled in left-wing activist causes and was dating Wojtek Frykowski at the time of the murders. Frykowski was a Polish immigrant who'd become close with Roman Polanski when they were students in Poland. After multiple unsuccessful attempts at riding Polanski's coattails into a job in the film industry, Frykowski had resorted to living off Folger's trust fund and selling drugs to make money. Sharon Tate was an up-and-coming actress, the wife of Roman Polanski, and ex-girlfriend of Jay Sebring. Sebring was well known as a celebrity hairstylist who catered to Hollywood actors, with a client list that included Frank Sinatra, Warren Beatty, and Steve McQueen. But perhaps more relevant for our purposes, Sebring also maintained a parallel line of income as a drug dealer to the stars, whose nickname, according to multiple sources, was the Candyman. In fact, according to the property report compiled by police at Cielo Drive, and Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, the drugs found in and around the house after the murders included at least 13 grams of weed and multiple joints and roaches spread throughout the house and Sebring's car, 30 grams of hashish, 1 tube and 1 vial of a white powdery substance found in Sebring's car and jacket, along with an unidentified brown sticky substance presumed to be narcotics, 10 white capsules of MDA, 4 brown pills, and 7 green pills. For his book, The Manson File, the author Nikolas Schreck was able to interview both Rudy Altobelli, the owner of the Cielo Drive house who was renting it to his friends, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, and Gene Katowski, Polanski's close friend who produced many of his movies. And according to Schreck, the house at Cielo Drive was well known as a party house, with constant visitors, social events, and people moving in and out, including temporary drug dealers and residents, both before and after the murders. Before Polanski took up residence there, the house at Cielo had been occupied by Terry Melcher and Candace Bergen, and it turns out that multiple family members, including Dean Morehouse and Tex Watson, frequented the Cielo house during this period. In later interviews, Manson claimed that he'd met Sharon Tate at parties on multiple occasions as well. So despite the prosecution's depiction of the killers as complete strangers to their victims, in reality there was extensive overlap in the social scenes at Spahn Ranch and Cielo. In the aftermath of the murders, a receptionist at Jay Sebring's hair salon named Charlene McCaffrey told police that on August 7th, the day before the murders, Sebring had told her that he'd been burned on $2,000 worth of cocaine. McCaffrey also said that a drug dealer named Joel Rostow had told her that on the night of the murders, he delivered cocaine and mescaline to Sebring and Frykowski at the Cielo house, and they wanted to buy more, but Rostow had been unable to procure it. Rostow later denied the story, telling police that he'd made it up to impress McCaffrey, but Nikolas Schreck uncovered evidence that there was, indeed, at least one delivery of narcotics to the Tate house that night. Sharon's mother, Doris Tate, believed that she'd discovered evidence that a call had come into Cielo Drive from Spahn Ranch in the hours before the murders, and there's been widespread speculation that it was a member of the family placing an order for drugs from Sebring or Frykowski, which they intended to steal later that night. But even among those who agree that the motive for the murders was drug-related, there are different theories about the source of the disputes. One possibility was laid out by Sebring's protege and partner in the salon business, Jim Markham, in an interview he gave to The Hollywood Reporter in July of 2019, just months after the release of Chaos. After acknowledging Sebring's drug dealing and his Candyman moniker, Markham says this: "I don't want to get into the drugs, but I never bought into the race war theory. I believe Manson had gone up to the house. Polanski was away shooting a movie, and Manson wanted to sell cocaine and marijuana. He showed Jay and Wojtek the product. They were going to buy some of it, but the two of them beat him up at the gate. The next night, Manson sent the family up to kill them. I've lived with that for 50 years. I still believe that." In the Spahn Ranch raid warrant application, there's a memo dated August 7th, the day before the Cielo murders, in which an LAPD sergeant said that he had information indicating that Manson was in San Francisco, but was planning to return to Spahn Ranch by August 8th with a large amount of narcotics. Could this have been the cocaine and marijuana that Markham was referring to? Obviously, this is just speculation, but it is strangely coincidental that Sebring's business partner and an LAPD memo would converge on this point. Much of the testimonial evidence regarding the motive revolves around the conversations at Spahn Ranch during the lead-up to the murders, who proposed what orders were given, and so on. And surprisingly, many of the eyewitness accounts suggest that the idea for the first night of crimes came from the women on the ranch, rather than Manson himself. For instance, during the trial at which Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were convicted of the Tate LaBianca murders, family member Nancy Pittman was asked, "What did Linda Kasabian tell you happened after they'd returned from Cielo?" Pittman answered, "They went up to a house where she had known some people before, and these were people who had burned her for some money or something, on some dope deal. And she told me they went up there and they killed them." During the same trial, Catherine Gypsy Scher said, "Linda Kasabian overheard our conversation that Bobby Beausoleil had been arrested for the death of Gary Hinman. She said, 'I'd do anything to get my brother out of jail. I know some people in Beverly Hills that burned me on a drug buy. You can make it look like somebody else did it if you copycat the murders. We can make more of the same. They'll cut Bobby loose." Susan Atkins told the same story. Linda Kasabian said, "Make it look like somebody else did it. Do a copy. Make some more of the same. Lots of them everywhere, and they'll cut Bobby loose, and everyone will go free." Atkins said that the night of the Tate slayings, it was Mrs. Kasabian who led them to the Tate home. She said the young woman had been burned in trying to purchase some drugs at the Tate residence, and that she picked that site so she could get revenge. Now, obviously, the family member's trial testimony is often disregarded as self-serving or engineered to exonerate Manson, and to be clear, those examples come from the penalty phase of the trial, when Manson and the others had already been convicted. But in the years since the trials, other family members have reaffirmed the basic narrative that the goal of the murders was to free Bobby Beausoleil. And ironically, the only person whose story has remained pretty much entirely consistent since 1969 is Manson himself, who always said the plan for the Tate murders was concocted by the women at Spahn Ranch after he demanded that they find a way to get Beausoleil out of jail. Manson always claimed that he wanted to free Beausoleil because he couldn't bear the thought of his brother Bobby rotting in jail. But a far more plausible possibility is that Manson just feared that Beausoleil was going to snitch on him over his involvement in the Hinman murder. Remember Beausoleil's phone call to the ranch about leaving a sign? Under this version of the motive, the call makes perfect sense. Because Gary Hinman was involved in radical politics, Beausoleil had left graffiti in his apartment to frame the Panthers for the murder. Beausoleil's statements as reported don't even necessarily imply that he was asking the family to commit murder, just that they should copy the graffiti he left to make the cops think the real killer was still at large and affiliated with radical politics. It also explains why Manson was so adamant about leaving a sign in his instructions to the killers at Cielo.
Did you tell the women to do their witchy things?
I said, if you're going to do something, leave something witchy. Just like I would tell you, if you're going to do something, do it well. And leave something witchy. Leave a sign to let the world know that you were there. Have a good day.
Did you tell them which words?
No.
Pig?
No.
Helter, Skelter?
No.
Arise?
Nope.
This idea that the murders were about returning favors and debts owed was another constant in Manson's version of events. Tex owed Manson for shooting Bernard Crowe, Manson owed Beausoleil for not snitching on his involvement in Hinman's murder, and according to Manson, Tate LaBianca was just him calling in the family's debts to get Bobby out of jail.
That reality comes from handball courts and weightlifting piles, and it comes from someone dropping weight on somebody else's head, of somebody owing something, of a blood family debt, that the way it burns back and forwards to where if Watson has got something he can't face and I go face his death for him, then he owes me back. And then the Frenchman takes his foils and goes off into the battle for me, and I owe him one heart. So then I come back to Watson and I say, you pay the Frenchman what you owe me. He said, how do I pay it? I said, don't ask me how, I'm not your father. Do what you're told. Pay your debt or get off my road. So he pays what he has to pay, and he does what he has to do. I didn't direct him to do anything. You know, we're sitting in a circle trying to figure out how we're going to do certain things, and here comes a guy from Texas who's his mama's boy. It gets me in trouble going one way, Dick. Then Bobby gets busted. Then everybody comes around and says, Bobby's in jail. I said, I'm not going to let my brother in jail. In other words, I'm very strong in the brotherhood. And I don't let my brother down. In other words, I know I am my brother. If I don't help me, I'm not, there is no brother. So they say, what do we do? I said, I don't know what you do. Get him out of jail. They said, how do we get him out of jail? I'm not educated. I don't go to school, man. I don't know how you do it. That's what you went to school for. You do it. You do it. Well, how do we do it? I said, how do I know what you do? I have no idea what you do. I know you owe me your life, tramp. You owe me your life. Pay me or get the hell away from me. It's that simple. I stand up for you. I march to hell with you. I go through all the things it takes to save your life, and then you come back to me and tell me, you dig what I'm saying? You got a brother over here. Get him out of jail. They said, and they said, well, we'll get a lawyer. And someone said, well, you get a lawyer. Lawyer's just going to take your money and lie.
So Tex has a little problem. He has a little problem. He gives me a gun. He can't deal with it. I have to go deal with his problem.
Which is?
I have to go shoot somebody for him because he's too much of a coward. And he's laying up underneath the bed with it.
Who'd you shoot?
I had to shoot lots of Papa.
Who?
Some guy down in the drug world. I had to go down and take care of some business that was not my business. So Tex owed me one. So when I come back and I say, see, you got me in trouble. Every time I stand up for you, brother, I got to face your life and your death. You dig? I'm tired of carrying you on my back. And I threw the gun. I said, now you owe me one. And if you don't pay me when you owe me, then I'm going to pay you what you owe me. You see what I'm saying? In other words, I have to go into another person and put on another face and come back and play, you know.
I understand. So you say to Tex, you owe me one.
That's right. So then when my brother gets busted and my brother's in jail, then I tell Tex, pay him what you owe me.
This theme is also present with the Mike Deasy LSD freakout incident and Terry Melcher. Manson blamed Melcher for bringing Mike Deasy to the ranch and almost getting Manson killed, and he believed Melcher owed him money for music they'd worked on together.
You didn't have a beef with those people? No, not at all. I'll tell you what it was. Terry Melcher come up to the ranch and made some promises to a lot of people he didn't keep. It had nothing to do with me.
But if it had anything to do with it being Terry Melcher's house once.
It was Terry Melcher's house because the people were at that ranch was mad at Terry Melcher because he didn't do what he said, number one. Number two, he sent somebody over there to fight. He caused some trouble. He almost got some other people killed. Some people put their life on the line because of Terry Melcher. Terry Melcher didn't even know about it. He wasn't even, no one ever told him about it. And this is the first time I've ever even brought it up. And when these people broke their words, they said to Master, I'm talking about Melcher, when he broke his word, he didn't do what he said he was going to do. Sharon Tate and those people were killed because Terry Melcher broke a contract and sent 3 Orientals with hatchets over to kill somebody else.
Maybe this was why Melcher was seen at the ranch, on his knees, begging Manson for something shortly after the murders. And as we'll soon see, there were other debts Manson tried to call in the days of the murders. As for the plausibility of Linda Kasabian getting burned on a drug deal at Cielo, it turns out that Kasabian actually had been deeply involved in the narcotics trade, starting long before she ever met the family. In 1967, Kasabian was arrested in Boston under her maiden name, Linda Druin, in a raid by both state and federal police, where she was found in a house containing $20,000, that's around $180,000 in 2026 money, worth of weed, LSD, and pills. Kasabian had only been living at the ranch for about a month at the time of the murders, and she immediately shacked up with Tex Watson, who we already know was involved in the drug trade and drug dealer robberies. And according to Nikolas Schreck, Frykowski and Sebring were expecting a large delivery of narcotics, most likely MDA, on the night of August 8th. Linda Kasabian was one of the only people who was in the car both nights of the murders, but in the Helter Skelter narrative, Bugliosi explains this away by claiming that Kasabian was chosen to be the driver both nights because she was the only family member with a valid driver's license. But researchers from the Manson blog discovered that Kasabian had been arrested in New Hampshire for driving without a valid license in May of 1969, just 3 months before the murders. And during the Tate LaBianca investigation, an LAPD lieutenant named Earl Deemer made a list of all known Manson family associates, now known as the Deemer list, which included the names and driver's license numbers for every family member Deemer could identify. But in the entry for Linda Kasabian, no driver's license number is listed. So if Kasabian wasn't at the murder scenes simply as a chauffeur, then why was she really there? One of the few elements of the killer's accounts of the Cielo Drive murders that's remained consistent over time is that Tex Watson and Susan Atkins were on a speed binge before and during the murders. And Watson in particular seems to have been on some kind of hallucinogenic or dissociative drug, most likely belladonna or LSD. Watson's psychiatric interviews especially give the impression he was heavily intoxicated during the Tate murders. I had a gun and a knife in my hand. The car stopped and I just pulled the trigger. About 10 days later, I couldn't believe I'd done it. There was no hesitation. She said, "Get him," and I got him. No thought. I could just feel my body getting sucked in like a monkey. No feeling at all. I had no feeling. Susan Atkins would kick me to get me going. Then I saw Katie stabbing this guy, and I had a knife in my hand, and I did the same thing. The guy was all messed up. Defendant laughing at this point. All of a sudden, Sadie hollered again. The second guy was real big, and she was stabbing him all over, and blood was spurting everywhere, and she was hollering for me, and I came over and he fell outside of the house. I got over and the body was totally messed up, so I decided to hit him again and again in the head until his head cracked open. How do you feel about what you did? It was fun tearing up the Tate house, okay? It was fun? You should have seen it. People were running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Defendant is laughing. Susan Atkins would later describe Tex's strength and violence that night as being superhuman.
Now, what did Tex really do there? What did you observe?
Yeah, of what I saw happening in Tex, the way he moved, the viciousness and cold. It was just like seeing somebody go crazy with more power than I've ever seen anybody. I don't think he was in control of himself. I think that he was in control of, in their own human strength, could do what Tex did.
Well, Charles Manson was in control of him, right?
Yeah, as far as giving orders, but I don't think Charles Manson's mind was in control of Tex's mind that night. I think that it was a higher power than that. Charlie's human too, you know, and his mental powers are just as limited, maybe not as limited as other humans, but that there was an evil force in control of Tex that night.
Well, it was in control of all of you, obviously.
He did things that, you've heard stories, I'm sure, of people who have lifted up cars off of other people, how they have superhuman strength. Well, Tex had that kind of strength that night.
During a mental health assessment for a 1978 parole hearing, Atkins described the crimes as a paranoid speed delusion. And some writers have speculated that Tex Watson may have been in some kind of methamphetamine psychosis during the Tate murders. According to Manson, the Cielo Drive killings only happened because Tex Watson was loaded and freaked out.
And why did they kill people that night? What did they think they were doing for you?
They freaked out, man. Tex was stoned. Everybody was loaded, man.
The actual timeline of events during the Cielo murders is virtually impossible to pin down. The killers' accounts are inconsistent over time and contradict each other. But there were also several third-party witnesses who claimed to have heard arguing, screams, and gunshots in the area of the Tate house between 1 and 4:15 a.m., when the prosecution narrative had the killers leaving the house by 12:50 a.m. The version of the murders presented by the DA had them arriving a little before 12:30, committing the murders immediately, starting with shooting Stephen Perrin in the driveway and leaving before 1 a.m. Obviously, this is impossible to square with witness statements about gunshots and screams between 2 and 4 a.m. When you read the killer's early accounts of the Tate murder scene, you quickly get the impression that the girls were constantly calling Tex over to them because one of the victims was resisting or trying to flee, and most of the violence was inflicted by Tex to prevent the victims from overpowering the girls or getting away. If you rely exclusively on the earliest narrative accounts of the crimes, it almost sounds like a bungled home invasion robbery, where the girls were just trying to keep the victims in one room, or maybe prevent them from leaving, kind of like Bobby Beausoleil with Gary Hinman. But then some kind of struggle broke out and panic ensued, kicking off a frantic melee after the first victim was seriously injured. This could certainly explain the screams and gunshots after 1 a.m. If 1 or 2 of the victims were killed, and the remaining victims stopped resisting, it's easy to imagine a scenario where the intoxicated killers spend an hour or 2 debating what to do with the surviving witnesses, and only killed their remaining victims much later. Again, just like with Gary Hinman. In fact, judging by their early testimony, it's not even clear that the killers left the ranch that first night knowing they were going to murder anyone. It's entirely possible that at least some of them were just expecting another creepy crawl or a drug burn, and the murders were unintended consequences. The low dollar value of the items the killers stole that night is often pointed to as evidence that the crimes weren't intended as robberies, but the fact that they stole anything at all suggests that murder wasn't the only goal that night. If the actual objective was to free Bobby Beausoleil, they may have left the ranch looking for quick money to fund his legal defense with no real plan at all. Before the release of Chaos, there had been decades of speculation about Manson going to Cielo Drive the night of the murders, after the killers had returned to the ranch. In the book, Manson in his own words, Nuel Emmons quotes Manson saying that he went to Cielo with an unnamed accomplice to stage the crime scene, but Manson always publicly denied it. However, during the research for Chaos, O'Neill found a prison kite Manson had written to Linda Kasabian, in which Manson seemingly takes credit for placing a pair of eyeglasses at the Tate murder scene to mislead police. What was so important that Manson would again choose to insert himself into a murder scene that he could just as easily have stayed away from? Obviously, something went wrong at Cielo, or some goal wasn't accomplished. Had the girls forgotten to leave a sign in the middle of all the violence? Or did the killers fail to procure the money, drugs, or valuables they went there intending to steal? One of the most striking pieces of evidence O'Neill's put forward regarding the motive doesn't actually appear in Chaos, and it has to do with the cut phone lines at Cielo. You can listen to the story at about 2 hours and 41 minutes in his Rogan interview, but O'Neill says that he interviewed a man named Paul Greenwald who did all the wiring at Jay Sebring's house, and Greenwald told him that on August 7th, the night before the Tate murders, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, and Abigail Folger were watching cable TV at Sebring's house when, quote, all of a sudden there was a power surge and the lights went really, really bright and dimmed and they lost the cable. The next night, August 8th, those same 4 people were murdered at Cielo Drive. O'Neill says a few days after the murders, Paul Greenwald was sent to Sebring's house to pick up a suit for Sebring to be buried in, and while he was at the house, he decided to look at the wiring. Greenwald, quote, wanted to see what had happened to the wires, since I'd put all the wires in, and I did a circle of the house, and I found the wires cut. These were deliberately cut. I could tell by the gradation and the angle. And he told the police that. So the night before they were killed, somebody cut the wires at 9 o'clock at night when Sebring made the phone call about the cable outage. And he said from what Jay had told him about the power surge, all the floodlights got really bright and then dimmed. The killers all agreed that on August 8th, the night of the Cielo Drive murders, Tex Watson climbed a telephone pole outside the Tate house and cut the phone lines. The obvious implication here is that the family had been stalking Sebring and had attempted to attack him on August 7th, but got spooked when Tex accidentally cut the power line, causing a power surge. This next part gets kind of complicated, but it's important. O'Neill's only source for this story is Paul Greenwald and his 1969 police report. O'Neill is saying that Greenwald told him that on August 7th, 1969, Jay Sebring called Greenwald saying there'd been a simultaneous power surge and cable TV outage at his house. A few days later, Greenwald discovered that the power lines and cable wires on Sebring's property had been cut, and judging by the timing of Sebring's phone call, this must have occurred around 9 o'clock on August 7th, the night before the same 4 people were murdered at the Tate house. And according to O'Neill, this was all told to the police in 1969. But here's the problem with that. 3 years ago, Tom O'Neill posted a copy of Paul Greenwald's police report on his social media. You can see it in his YouTube video titled Sebring Wires. Look at what Greenwald actually said in 1969. He first noticed the cut wires not on August 7th, but on either the 4th or the 5th. And those wires weren't cable TV or power lines, they were wires connected to a floodlight. Then, days later, on August 7th, Sebring reported the cable outage to Greenwald around 9 p.m., and there's no mention of a power surge anywhere. Jay Sebring's nephew, Anthony DeMaria, re-interviewed Paul Greenwald for a book and documentary he released titled Jay Sebring Cutting to the Truth, and he found this memo Paul Greenwald had written to Sebring in February of 1969, saying, quote, sorry about those outside lights. I'll be home in 2 weeks and repair them. When DeMaria directly asked Greenwald if Jay Sebring had ever mentioned anything about a power surge, Greenwald said no, and admitted that he'd completely forgotten about the issues with the outdoor lights, and that the wires in question could very likely have been severed back in February. O'Neill's entire power surge story rests solely on his theory that Sebring reported a power surge to Paul Greenwald on August 7th, because that's the only evidence that the family was outside Sebring's house that night. So if Greenwald says Sebring never mentioned a power surge, then how did O'Neill even determine a power surge happened in the first place? Well, in that same video on O'Neill's YouTube channel, you can actually listen to part of one of his recorded interviews with Paul Greenwald. And Greenwald never claims Sebring said anything about a power surge. He's just speculating about what would have happened if there was a power surge, based on O'Neill's questioning. Remember, we started with O'Neill claiming the night before they were killed, somebody cut the wires at 9 o'clock at night when Sebring called Greenwald reporting a cable outage and power surge. O'Neill quotes Greenwald saying, from what Jay had told him about the power surge, all the floodlights got really bright and then dimmed. In his Rogan interview, O'Neill calls this one of the most important things he found during his investigation. But what evidence do we actually have here? The only documents from 1969 suggest that the cut wires were connected to floodlights, not the power supply or cable TV. The same documents suggest that the wires were severed days or months before August 7th. We don't have any evidence that Jay Sebring reported a power surge on August 7th to Paul Greenwald or anyone else. All we have is Paul Greenwald saying Sebring called him that night around 9 p.m. about the cable going out, just as he told police days after the event itself. So what exactly is the evidence that the family was outside Jay Sebring's house on August 7th, 1969? When it came to Cielo, Manson always suggested in interviews that Tex Watson chose that house as the target, rather than any specific victim.
Explain to me simply why that house that night, why they
Which
went
house?
there.
Which night?
The house on Cielo Drive, the Tate house. Why did they go there that night?
Because Tex had been there before, and he went to a familiar place. So now, wait a minute. Criminal behavior's the same. It's mundane in most minds. Criminal will always go to a familiar place. Tex had been to that house. Tex went back to that house.
You're telling us about the other reasons why.
One thought can change a million perspectives. You know, you can have one word change. Tex had familiarity of the surroundings.
Okay, so Tex has gone there because it's familiar.
That in part, and partly.
How come it was familiar? How come it was familiar to him? He'd been there?
Yeah, he went there with Dean Morehouse.
But there was another nexus between the victims and the family, which Chaos only hints at. The oft-forgotten fifth victim that night at Cielo Drive was a young man named Stephen Parent, who, according to the official story, was visiting the guest cottage behind the main house that night in an attempt to sell a clock radio to the house's 19-year-old live-in caretaker, William Garretson. According to the killers, Stephen Parent was the first victim to be killed. He was shot by Tex Watson almost immediately after the group had entered the grounds at Cielo. William Garretson, however, mysteriously survived. According to the official story, he didn't hear any commotion outside and spent the night safely ensconced in the guest house, which the killers supposedly never checked. This part of the narrative has been a point of extreme skepticism among Manson case researchers for years. Why was Stephen Parent trying to sell a clock radio at midnight to someone he apparently barely even knew? How did Garretson manage not only to survive, but to avoid noticing anything amiss during the slaughter and gunshots occurring just a few feet away? Most of his Stephen Parent-related research didn't make it into the final edit of Chaos, but O'Neill discovered that Parent was gay and was apparently involved in an illicit, probably abusive relationship with a male priest who'd been a friend of the Parent family. There have been persistent rumors over the years that William Garretson was actually a male hustler and had been busy with a client, usually identified as the actor Cary Grant, during the murders, and the clock radio sale was made up by prosecutors as a cover story. This has never been proven for obvious reasons, but there are connections between Cielo Drive and the sex trade that are much less speculative. O'Neill was able to coax an admission out of Bugliosi that the prosecutors had lied about the contents of the sex tape police discovered in the house after the murders. Rather than depicting Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, it featured Tate with two other men in a scene being directed by Polanski. But highlighting this one tape in isolation actually obscures the bigger picture. The author Nikolas Schreck discovered that the house's owner, Rudy Altobelli, had been running a gay porn production company called Cottage Films from the guest house at Cielo, the name being a reference to the cottage-like appearance of the guest house and the British gay slang term cottaging. Polanski's social circle, which included Hugh Hefner, Yul Brynner, and Peter Sellers, was engaged in the creation and trade of homemade pornographic films, using state-of-the-art home video systems and the newly invented videotape recorder. In the Manson File, Nikolas Schreck reprints a quote Terry Melcher gave to a writer working on a biography of his mother, Doris Day, saying that when he first heard of the murders committed at his former residence, he immediately assumed that this celebrity porno ring had something to do with it. I hadn't been in the house since I moved out, but I'd presumed that the murders had had something to do with the weird films Polanski had made, and the equally weird people who were hanging around that house. I knew they were making a lot of homemade, sadomasochistic porno movies there, with quite a few recognizable Hollywood faces in them. The reason I knew was that I'd gone out with a girl named Michelle Phillips, one of the mamas and the papas, whose ex-husband, John Phillips, was the leader of the group. Michelle told me that she and John had had dinner one night to discuss maybe getting back together, and afterward he'd taken her up to visit the Polanskis in my old house. Michelle said that when they arrived there, everyone in the house was busy filming an orgy, and that Sharon Tate was part of it. This was just one of the stories I'd heard about what went on in my former home. When Bobby Beausoleil gave an interview to Truman Capote in the 1970s, and Capote described the Cielo Drive victims as total strangers and innocent people, Beausoleil snapped back, "Who says they were innocent? They burned people on dope deals, Sharon Tate and that gang. They picked up kids on the strip and took them home and whipped them. Made movies of it. Ask the cops. They found the movies. Not that they'd tell you the truth." The actor Dennis Hopper, whose social circle overlapped with Polanski's, told the LA Free Press that the crowd at Cielo had fallen into sadism and masochism and bestiality, and they recorded it all on videotape too. The LA police told me this. In the Manson File, Nikolas Schreck quotes the actress Joanna Pettit, one of Sharon Tate's best friends, who was among the last people to see her alive, telling the journalist David Dalton that she was sure the killings involved some drug deal gone wrong, or revenge by an outraged lover for some kinky sex scene. Sharon had told her that Polanski was in the habit of making home movies of himself having sex with young girls and then showing them to Sharon while they were making love. Jay Sebring, she said, was into some very kinky stuff. It was that kind of scene. O'Neill reports that the Cielo Drive residence was known for hosting orgies organized by Roman Polanski without Sharon Tate's knowledge, and quotes the writer, Dominic Dunn, saying, "I never went to their orgies, but I know they existed, and I think Jay Sebring was in on it too." And Manson himself frequently referred to these connections in interviews over the years.
They was the cult. Did they tell you about all the film that they got with the dogs and the chauffeurs that came out of the black and white when Yul Brynner and Peter Sellers paid $30,000 to get the videotapes back that they had done with the pornography where they was gobbling on each other's knobs in the closet with Sharon, poor Sharon, beautiful Sharon?
How did you didn't have a beef with Sharon Tate and those people?
No.
Did you notice?
I had met a couple of them 2 times. Photographers that used to do that. There's some homosexuals there, and I know a lot of the homosexuals.
Okay, so Tex has gone there because it's familiar. He's been there before. Did you ever go there?
Yeah.
What took you there?
The homosexuals that lived in the back.
Who was that? Garrettson?
A guy that used to deal grass and some other things. Pornography. Polanski was in, see, here's the thing, man. I don't want to start pulling people's covers. But all them people that you thought were so wonderful and nice, wonderful, you know, they wasn't as wonderful as you thought their dogs might have been on the chauffeur's night off. You dig? In other words, there's all kinds of things happening in the darkness of what was going on that, you know, like how does someone from Poland get to Hollywood and go all the way over the top and, you know, have everything it is like a Valley of the Dolls. Where does one camera click in and what film are we sending to Hong Kong for the other?
His references to the homosexual in the back almost certainly refer to Rudy Altobelli, who lived in the guest house at Cielo on and off, and was known to hire young men, often drug dealers and gay hustlers, to house sit while he was away. It's speculated that William Garretson, the so-called caretaker at Cielo, was one of these men, and Tex Watson may have been as well. According to Nikolas Schreck, Altobelli claimed that Watson had even been in some kind of romantic relationship with Sebring before the murders. In a letter to a tabloid journalist, Manson described the video camera Dennis Wilson had given him as a $5,000 videotape TV thing for tapes that fit only an elite bunch porno ring that was worldwide, and that he had, quote, heard Polanski got money from dog and children movies. In correspondence over years, Manson made frequent oblique references to his time as a hustler serving both male and female clients from the Hollywood elite. Specifically, Manson mentioned being asked to participate in threesomes with both Jane Fonda and Elvis Presley. We kicked Jane Fonda out of that dream because her Jewish boyfriend wanted to bring a black guy to play ping pong with her, and I said I don't play mixing blood for phony Christians that work for their money selling children. She had a big dog and a crummy camera, and I said no, I do what I do for love, not money. She was, I think, making some kind of videotapes like Peter Sellers and Yul Brynner were making. One night a girl took me to Elvis's pad with big iron gates, and she was begging to suck on my ice cream. Elvis's wife came home that night, and when Dennis Wilson came around, he had so many broads. Elvis got afraid because that little girl had his heart. I could have eaten it there in front of him, but I was playing a front, and I was having sex in the back. I could have f***ed him. He had a car I wanted, but Terry Melcher gave one of my buddies a new XKZ Jaguar for me because he didn't want anyone to know about me and his mom. But O'Neill only scratches the surface of the sex trade angle in Chaos. For example, he quotes Bob April, a fringe member of the family, saying that Manson would supply girls for executive parties that Terry Melcher threw, giving well-heeled business types unfettered access to Manson's girls. According to O'Neill, in exchange, Manson expected help with his music career, and possibly a record deal. Manson clearly was making money as both a pimp and a hustler, but the market for pimping had become much more difficult in an environment of free love. It seems like he wasn't conducting straight cash transactions so much as just allowing access to the girls in exchange for social networking, a place to stay, or just a favor that he expected to be able to call in at some time in the future. In Manson in his own words, Manson describes one of the Canoga Park houses the family lived in, nicknamed the Yellow Submarine. Within 3 or 4 weeks of moving in, it had become a concert hall for musicians, a porno studio for kinky producers, a dope pad, a thieves' lair, a place to dismantle stolen cars, and just about everything but a whorehouse. Not a body was sold. Shared for favors returned, maybe, but not sold for dollars. And this theme of Manson calling in favors from people who he felt owed him something was very clearly woven throughout both nights of murder. O'Neill doesn't get into the La Bianca killings and Chaos, so we'll have to save that topic for a future video, but there are a few elements of the second night that are worth mentioning. Unlike the first night of murder, on August 9th, Manson went with the killers, and by all accounts was directly involved in selecting what house to target. The group spent considerable time driving around, evaluating different candidates, but it's clear that before settling on the La Bianca residence, they first went to another house in the same neighborhood, which had been occupied by an acquaintance of the family named Harold True. There are indications that they initially planned on targeting True, but discovered the house was empty and went to the La Biancas next door instead. The evidence isn't conclusive, but if the La Bianca house really was spontaneously chosen because it just happened to be situated next to the first intended target, it lends credence to the idea that the La Biancas were chosen basically at random, as opposed to being part of some larger plan. It's rarely mentioned that the killers also went to an apartment building that night, ostensibly to target a struggling actor named Saladin Nader, but left after failing to locate his apartment. This fact is often argued to minimize Linda Kasabian's culpability, since she claimed to have knocked on the wrong apartment door on purpose. But it's notable that Linda Kasabian was the only person in the car that night with any known connection to Nader, suggesting that at least in that case, she was the one proposing possible targets. But there was another potential victim from August 9th whose story has been almost completely ignored in Manson media, a woman named Melba Cronkright. Cronkite owned a ranch near Malibu with a stable of horses, and after meeting Manson in 1968, she began paying the family to perform caretaker duties for the grounds and horses. After months of Manson and the family helping to maintain the Malibu property, Cronkite told them she couldn't afford to keep paying for their services. But instead of quitting, the family continued working on the grounds for several more months without being paid, eventually breaking off contact after moving to Spahn Ranch. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Cronkite wrote a letter to the police, saying that on the night of the LaBianca murders, Manson had shown up at her house asking for money. Charles Manson came here in the middle of the night and said that he needed money to get Mary Bruner out of jail. I told him that I didn't have any money, but if I did, that I would only get myself in trouble in helping them, and my daughter was a police sergeant, etc. He left, but I'm sure that this was the same night the couple that owned the grocery store was killed. So the only potential victim who actually interacted with the killers on one of the murder nights and survived told police that Manson had come to her house on August 9th seeking money. Not to start a race war, not to kill random strangers and blame it on the Panthers, just money. And for all the seemingly infinite questions about the murders at the Tate house, the motive for targeting the LaBiancas is even more mysterious. As mentioned earlier, Chaos has very little to say about the LaBianca murders, but there is one passage relevant to the motive that's worth looking at here. O'Neill was able to find notes from a detective's interview with the cellmate Susan Atkins allegedly confessed to, Ronnie Howard, from November 18, 1969, the day after Howard first called the LAPD, saying she had information about the Sharon Tate case. These notes are the earliest known police document connecting the family to the Tate LaBianca murders, produced weeks before Bugliosi had cobbled together the official story. According to Chaos, Howard told the detective that Susan Atkins said they'd killed the LaBianca couple because of something to do with blackmail, although she couldn't elaborate. Some of the earliest investigative reports from the LA police detail Leno LaBianca's mafia connections, and he was in substantial gambling debt at the time of the murders. Leno was a partial owner of his family's chain of supermarkets, but he'd been caught embezzling from the company, and on August 9th, the day the LaBiancas were killed, Leno had been scheduled to attend a family meeting to sign over his shares in the business to other relatives, a meeting which Leno skipped.
And as our investigation shows, the second part of Manson's deadly assignment probably came from the mob. Here again, Craig Rivera.
Manson's mob connections go back to his many years in prison. In this 1988 interview with our Geraldo Rivera, Manson talked about his ties to the mob.
Do you know anything about the underworld?
I know a lot about the underworld.
You know something about the family?
I know a lot about the family.
But when you owe the family something, you generally pay it.
So?
There's a Holy Spirit that runs in that family.
So?
I pitched horseshoes with Frank Costello in 1952.
Manson did indeed meet mob boss Frank Costello in federal prison. Later, he met one of Costello's buddies, Frankie Carbo, at another jail. Carbo, an underworld czar, had major connections into Nevada gambling and sports betting, a significant factor in the LaBianca case.
I knew Frankie Carbo. Frankie Carbo knew Leno LaBianca.
This critical admission links Manson to the mob and the mob to the LaBianca killings. Manson also mentions a mysterious black book that he says he was told to get from LaBianca.
When Leno LaBianca got stabbed all up and all that gold and all that stuff was laying all around, the little black phone book from New York hit list was gone.
According to investigator Bill Nelson, who recently analyzed the LaBianca scene with Geraldo, Leno had serious financial troubles.
We know now that he had embezzled money for 2 years out of the grocery warehouse. He had been asked to resign by his mother and the other board members. The weekend before he was killed, he was supposed to go to a meeting and be forced to resign because of embezzlement. That meeting never took place.
Item: a fact that apparently connects LaBianca and gambling mobster Frankie Carbo's organization is that police reports state Leno LaBianca was a chronic gambler with a $500 a day habit and had personal loans of about $30,000. We have confirmed that LaBianca bet heavily at poker in Nevada, and according to Manson, high-stakes poker was part of the gambling debt.
In other words, there's a lot more to this road than you see. See?
Ed Sanders believes that LaBianca owed money to the mob, and it was payback time.
If they don't think they can get it back from you, or if by killing you they can shake it loose from family members, hey, you're dead.
If Charlie really wanted to start Helter Skelter, why did it stop?
I mean, he didn't have any reason to not kill the next night or the next night or the next night. You know, and why would it stop? And it did.
Joining me now, Brother Craig. The mob motive is a plausible scenario, I think, but only if Manson desperately needed money. Did he desperately need money?
He did need money. One of his followers earlier that week got arrested for another of the Manson murders.
Was that the Gary Hinman murder, the musician?
Bugliosi depicted the victims as being complete strangers to each other and the killers, but O'Neill obtained police reports showing that Leno LaBianca had been getting haircuts from Jay Sebring. Despite these connections, O'Neill has never publicly proposed a possible motive for targeting the LaBiancas beyond speculating that Manson may have been hired by unnamed mafia figures to collect on Leno's debts. And while Manson was always very forthcoming regarding how and why he believed the Tate House was targeted, his comments about the LaBianca murders were always much more circumspect. But there were two topics he often returned to when discussing the LaBiancas. The first was a story he'd referenced repeatedly in interviews about trying to collect money from the Beach Boys management for songs he'd written for them. I couldn't establish exactly when this took place, but Manson claimed he'd gone to the office of the Beach Boys manager, usually identified as Nick Grillo, demanding the thousands of dollars he'd been promised by members of the Beach Boys in exchange for recording songs Manson had written. Remember the theme of favors owed and collecting on debts? According to Manson, the manager refused to pay, and when Manson became belligerent, the manager threatened to call New York, implying that he had mafia protection, and Manson backed off.
So when I passed on that, I fell into the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys are being run by the Italian mafiosos that are trying to break through the mafia coming to the East Coast, that the Mexicans kicked him out of Rosarita and told him stay out of California because we don't like you. So the mafioso, when I went into Dennis Wilson's Beach Boys, I said, you owe me money for music, where's the money? They put me onto the Italian business manager. I said, don't I get something for this music here? And he said, no, you get nothing. He said, sue me. I said, I won't sue you, I'll bomb your car, man, I'll blow your house up. He said, I'll call New York and I'll call the mafia. Well, I know a lot of the dudes in the mafia, so I backed off of him.
So Tex, you did one for Tex? Tex had time for you to do what? Got to pay me back.
I got to pay the brother back.
Okay, so what did Tex do? What happened?
So Tex went to pay the brother back. When he went to pay the brother back to get Bobby back out of jail, you dig what I'm saying? They said, we'll go get a lawyer. And they said, get a fucking lawyer for what? All the lawyers do is lie and take the money, you know? Lawyers are not doing anything but for themselves, you dig? So they said, well, we'll make the murders keep on looking like it was keep on keeping on. You dig what I'm saying? So it jumped off into who was doing wrong. Who had the little black phone book from New York City that wasn't paying their debts over in Brother Recording Company. When Brother Recording Company from the Beach Boys was taking music that was coming out of the penitentiary and singing, in my room, I'll put out good vibrations. And then you come up on the set and you say, where's my money? And they say, oh, you don't have any money coming. I said, what you mean I don't have any money coming? You'll pay me. Give me what I got coming. Don't give me no more than what I got coming, but pay me what I got due. And they won't give me my dues. I said, okay, you don't give me my dues. I'll call New York. I'll call New York.
That's a horse's head thought that comes off a Ferrari, that big black 200 horse little red car that the business manager drives, and he's got the hitmen on the telephone over there on the Brother Recording Company.
According to Nikolas Schreck, in his private discussions with Manson about the motive over the years, this conflict with the Beach Boys and alleged mafia involvement seemed to be central to Manson's understanding of the LaBianca murders. Manson even suggested that rather than the Manson family murders, the crime should really be known as the Beach Boys murders. The other theme Manson frequently returned to in discussions of the LaBianca motive was his claim that Leno LaBianca specifically was killed over a little black book.
Now I'll tell you this, Leno LaBianca was killed for a black phone book with all the numbers in it. The phone numbers that controlled the music market. Sharon Tate and those people were killed because Terry Milcher broke a contract and sent 3 Orientals with hatchets over to kill somebody else.
Look here, I'm in jail because people want to keep me in jail. It ain't got nothing to do with the law. The law ain't got nothing to do with it. The mafioso was killed and the black phone book come up missing. When they did the music wrong and they put the half white, half black in the music, and Stromberg burnt my music up in Universal Studios, that's why Universal Studios been burnt down twice. And when these people broke their words, they said to Master, I'm talking about Melcher, when he broke his word, he didn't do what he said he was going to do. When Lino Badianca got stabbed all up and all that gold and all that stuff was laying all around, the little black phone book from New York hit list was gone. That came off the top of another penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. They come off the top of that poker game over there in Nevada, over where the divorce courts are running down through Denver and all that. In other words, there's a lot more to this road than you see.
This was the part of the murders that Manson was always cagiest about. From the context in which he mentioned it, Manson seemed to be implying that the little black book had something to do with the music industry, the Beach Boys management, and the mafia, but no one has yet been able to determine exactly what it was supposed to contain, or why it was so important to Manson. None of Manson's accomplices that night appear to have ever said anything about the black book, so whether or not they were even aware of its existence is an open question. How Susan Atkins' alleged mention of blackmail might play into this, I can't say, but curiously, it seems that after that initial confession to Ronnie Howard, Atkins never mentioned the blackmail angle again, at least in public. I understand that some of you may be wondering why this video generally treats Manson's testimony as worthy of serious consideration, rather than just rejecting it out of hand, as some writers, including Tom O'Neill, seem to do. And this may come as a surprise to those of you who aren't as familiar with the constellation of writers focused on serious Manson case research, but among those considered Manson experts, the idea that Manson generally avoided telling intentional lies is actually a relatively common and respectable position. The prohibition on lying was a core tenet of the philosophy Manson enforced within the family, and he was always adamant about remaining in the truth, marking it out as a point of pride for himself, and a transgression worthy of death when others didn't live up to it.
One of the things that Charlie always promoted about himself was, I don't lie.
Listen, my words, I live and die by my words. I've lived and died by my words all my life, for 45 years in prison. I keep my word. My word is my bond. I walk on my word. I live on my word. All right, here's the thing. In the penitentiary, you learn this. All right. Don't lie. Don't lie, man. If someone catches you in a lie, you leave yourself open to get snuffed. And all my life, I've lived in the eye that tell the truth. Pay your debts.
All these girls that you keep attributing me to were just girls that happened to be in their subculture that was in that free love trip. And the only reason they're still with me is because I've never lied to them. I don't lie, man. I quit lying a long time ago.
Unless it conflicted with his equally strict taboo against snitching on other people, Manson basically tried to tell the truth as he saw it, or at least avoided telling provable lies, and he studiously evaded answering questions that would require him to say things that weren't true. Even Manson's opponents, like the vile Bill Nelson, who became a Manson case expert by essentially stalking certain members of the family, had to admit that Manson, quote, never lies, he just withholds information. Whatever you believe about Manson's alleged connections to MKUltra, Operation Chaos, Reeve Whitson, and Jolly West, O'Neill's book did establish one undeniable, highly suspicious pattern in Manson's late 60s crime spree: his incredible ability to avoid consequences for his arrests and probation violations. In the book, O'Neill presents testimony from a former LA Sheriff's Office detective named Preston Guillory, who claimed that the local sheriff's station in Malibu, which was responsible for the Spahn Ranch area, had explicit orders to make no arrests and take no police action against Manson or the family. According to Guillory, memos about Manson's activities went straight to the station's captain, who seemed to be passing them on to people higher up on the chain of command, suggesting that the policy was an order from above rather than a local operation. We were told not to bother these people, Guillory said. One of the first things that I was told when I got to Malibu was to tell the captain whatever we saw or heard. We were asked to generate memos every time we had contact with any member of the family. Manson was under some kind of loose surveillance by our department or somebody else. We know he's being watched by somebody, but we don't know who. Guillory also came to believe that the initial raid on Spahn Ranch, the largest in California history up to that point, which came just a week after the Tate LaBianca murders, was all for show, part of an effort to cover their tracks after failing to stop the family before they murdered 8 people. It was like we were doing something perhaps a week late to show that we had really been watching. It appeared to me that the raid was more or less staged as an afterthought. There was some kind of a grand plan that we were participating in, but I never had the feeling the raid was necessary. But there's another angle on the Spahn Ranch raid that Chaos doesn't mention. In 2018, George Stimson's publishing imprint Peas and Hall Press released a memoir written by Lynette Fromey titled Reflection, which contains reprints of several letters she received from various members of the family over the years. One of these letters, from Catherine Gypsy Scher, details her recollections of the night before the raid. In the saloon I lay melting into the arms and oneness of myself. Charlie stirred and tucked me to him, saying half-consciously, "We're being raided in the morning," and he instantly fell asleep. As far as I can tell, Fromey's book is the only source we have for this claim, and she's reporting secondhand information she supposedly received in a letter from Gypsy Scher. But how plausible is this story? How could Manson possibly have known about the raid the day before it happened? Chaos and the raid warrant application make it abundantly clear that local police had informants at Spahn Ranch, and uniformed cops were stopping by and having conversations with Manson and others on a fairly regular basis. But this almost sounds like someone was passing information to Manson. Well, remember Bill Van Sickle, aka Bill Vance, Manson's friend from prison and the Girard Agency? In a 1972 police interview, Vance claimed that the family would get word from the LA Sheriff's Department before they ever come down, through the Satan slaves. Sure, the Satan slaves would call up from out there at the corral or wherever they was, at Topanga where they'd hang out there, and say the deputies will be there tomorrow night, or tonight maybe or something. One time a fireman pulled into the yard there. He said they're fixing to have a big police raid on this camp, and I'd advise you to tell all of them to get their camps and stuff out of there. Vance is asked, was this before the major raid? Yes. How did the slaves get their information? Vance answers, Sheriff's Department. The interviewer asks, yeah, but was there a leak inside the Sheriff's Department? Vance replies, oh sure, there's lots of them. There's lots of leaks in the Sheriff's Department. So at least according to Bill Vance, the bikers on the ranch were getting tipped off to any law enforcement actions there, and firemen would personally come to the ranch and tell the people there about impending raids. Obviously, the CIA wasn't using local firemen as cover for Operation Chaos. So the bare minimum implication here is that the family and the bikers had developed some kind of corrupt relationship with local law enforcement and firefighters. Manson was running something like an automotive chop shop on the ranch, and according to the raid warrant application, there was an LAPD cop named Phil Butler who owned a dune buggy shop in Chatsworth that was doing extensive business with both Manson and the Satan Slaves motorcycle gang. Manson and Butler had been selling dune buggies to each other, and the Satan Slaves told Malibu police that a cop, implied to be Butler in the warrant, had been giving them free Volkswagen parts. Could Butler have been passing along police information to Manson and the bikers? Besides the chop shop, Manson was operating an illegal nightclub, ironically named Helter Skelter, on the ranch, and obviously he was in the habit of making the girls available to anyone who could provide him some advantage. Manson clearly had some kind of corrupt economic relationship with the cop who owned the dune buggy shop near Spahn's, but what if he just compromised some of the other local officials the way he did with everyone else, through access to sex and parties? And if there was local police corruption, that could certainly explain the secrecy and hands-off policy that Preston Guillory described, if higher-ups were trying to figure out which officers were compromised. Obviously, this is just speculation, and even if some of the cops in Chatsworth were corrupt, that still doesn't explain the leniency that Manson received from judges and other authorities. In the book and interviews, O'Neill strongly implies without stating outright that his parole officer, Roger Smith, was somehow interfering in the legal process, possibly at the direction of the CIA, to keep Manson out of prison. But here's the problem with that. This is Manson's rap sheet from the DOJ's Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. According to the publicly available version of Manson's parole file, Roger Smith had ceased being Manson's PO by late April of 1968 at the latest. But look at the charges on his rap sheet. His only arrests during the period he was under Smith's supervision were an interfering with an officer charge, a failure to appear in court and making an illegal right turn, possessing a fake license, and weed possession. He was released for lack of evidence for the weed, paid a $10 fine on the fake license, and got probation on the interfering with an officer. But more importantly, where are all the serious arrests that would have required Roger Smith to be compromised to keep Manson out of prison? This is not an incidental issue, or just splitting hairs. The entire chaos narrative hinges on the idea that the CIA or some other federal agency was intervening through Roger Smith to make sure Manson stayed out of jail. When O'Neill's asked about this, he points to a 6-month period when Manson was charged with serious crimes which don't appear on his federal rap sheet, like grand theft auto and rape. But these arrests happened in 1969, months after Roger Smith had ceased being Manson's parole officer. For the period leading up to the murders, Manson's actual PO was a guy named Samuel Barrett, and he told O'Neill that he didn't violate Manson because the local DA never informed his office that Manson had been charged with a crime. No one I spoke to could even agree on whose job it was to report a federal parole violation. The DAs said it was the detective's job. The detectives said it was the DA's job. And at the end of the day, everyone said, wasn't it the parole officer's job? It's always been a problem, former Deputy Sheriff Bill Gleason told O'Neill, that guys would get arrested and released before the PO could place a hold. And this was all taking place in the 1960s. That means we're talking about paper records stored in filing cabinets being sent through snail mail, which can easily get misplaced or forgotten. But more importantly, it was before the era of mass incarceration. Even today, American media is replete with stories of repeat, violent offenders committing egregious crimes while out on parole despite having long rap sheets full of serious prior offenses. The period of Manson's criminal career in question took place from 1967 to 1969, when it was much, much harder to get sent to prison, especially on a mandatory parole violation, and especially on charges like a dismissed case of weed possession. O'Neill presented plenty of evidence that Roger Smith was gullible or incompetent, but if he wasn't the source of Manson's get-out-of-jail-free card, what does O'Neill think Smith was guilty of exactly? But there is one other possibility that chaos glosses over which needs to be considered. In interviews, Tom O'Neill has repeatedly told the story of a conversation he had with a former deputy DA named Louis Watnick, who was familiar with the protocol for federal parole in 1960s California.
I mean, there were all these violations, and it didn't make sense to me that he would keep getting free, that he had to get out of jail card, free card. So a kind of momentous moment or turning point was when I brought all that stuff to a retired deputy DA who had also been a criminal court judge in the San Fernando Valley, who actually had Manson in front of him on a minor violation in '68, I think. So he was retired. And I laid out everything I had in chronological order, and he was going through this at his home. And he was dying at the time. He was on a ventilator and had a real raspy voice, and he let me record him, and luckily I picked up what he said, and he just said, chicken shit, chicken shit, chicken shit. Everything you're showing me here is chicken shit. Somebody wanted him outside. He had somebody handling him, and he was more value to them outside than inside, meaning out free than inside back in prison. And he said, often you can attribute this kind of stuff to, bureaucratic red tape. We didn't have computers then, but not this much. He goes, I've never seen anything like this, except in the case of somebody who's an informant, who has a relationship with law enforcement. And I said, well, which law enforcement or which agency? He goes, that's your job. You've got to find that out. He said, I would be looking at the LAPD, the sheriffs, or I'd also look at the FBI. Yeah.
O'Neill readily accepts Watnick's premise that Manson must have been getting protection from above, but he ignores Watnick's actual conclusion, that Manson was an informant. This is a letter Manson wrote to the author of the book Charles Manson Now, Marilyn Marynick. Writing from Corcoran State Prison in 2010, Manson had this to say about his treatment at the hands of the government. They put me on the pay no mind list. They said, you're on the pay no mind list. They tell everyone, leave him alone and don't pay attention to him. Don't listen to him. Don't even mention his name. Don't say nothing about him. Just get rid of him. Get him away from us because we can't stand him. So I go outside and I go over to the music and the Grateful Dead is playing. And they put me on the witness program. Not because I snitched on somebody or betrayed a trust. I didn't snitch on nobody, and I didn't betray a trust. But they've got me on the federal witness program. They say leave this man alone. Don't put him in jail in any direction whatsoever. He's the devil and we can't control him, and we can't whip him. We can't beat him. He anticipates everything we're going to do. So stand off of him, because he'll destroy everything you fuck with him with. If you do something against him, it's going to turn back on you 1,000-fold. And so I'm out there walking around. Here comes the state of California and the Italian mafia, district attorney. They said I killed people. I ain't killed those people. That's what I tried to explain. I was on the witness program. The state of California should have never bothered me. They should have stood down off of me. I didn't have anything to do with that. That wasn't my play. Now, you might be inclined to dismiss this as just routine Charlie Manson rambling, but this wasn't the only time he alluded to having some kind of arrangement with the federal government.
Charlie Manson should never return to society. It was written because the news media said that Charlie Manson masterminded through his clan the outrageous murder of Sharon Tate, According to them, they did it to put fear into the system. Now the system may be putting fear into us. Federal Witness Protection Program has planned a program to release Charlie Manson.
Yeah, they offered me a place in Valachi.
Who was they?
The FBI.
What do you got to do with the FBI? You don't have nothing to do with the FBI. Nothing.
Yes, I do. I was a barber in the federal penitentiary for 20 years.
He's a snitch?
No.
These are extraordinary claims coming from Manson. In the convict code he preached, the only thing worse than lying was snitching or cooperating with police. And as you may have noticed, whenever he mentioned this arrangement, he always immediately followed it up with adamant denials that he'd snitched on anyone or betrayed a trust. And he was saying these things from inside prison. So these admissions wouldn't have just been embarrassing. They were legitimately dangerous. If Manson was going to make up a lie to minimize his culpability, would he really choose to make himself out to be an informant? What if all those cops and judges were going easy on Manson because they knew he was providing information on other people? When I decided to make this video, I set out with the goal of comparing Tom O'Neill's theory of the motive for the Tate LaBianca murders against the facts of the case and seeing how it holds up. And normally, at this point, I would compare the evidence I've presented to the theory O'Neill proposed and see how well it fits as an explanation. But after reading Chaos, reading it again, and listening to every Tom O'Neill interview I could find, one of the questions I've had the hardest time answering is, what is the chaos theory of the motive for Tate LaBianca? When Rogan directly asked O'Neill what he thinks the motive was, this was his response. If you look at the COINTELPRO objectives, which was to neutralize the left-wing movement, to make them look bad, and this is what drugs are going to do to your kids, the kind of outcome that these murders had was to make the hippies the boogeyman. I mean, the biggest boogeyman in U.S. history, at least until the 70s, became Charlie Manson. Because all of a sudden, you have photos on the front page of every paper in the world of these hippie women nursing children, living communally, who were accused of these horrible, brutal slayings. And what the reporters were saying was that they'd gone crazy on LSD and free love and the hippie ethic. And that was the same thing Chaos and COINTELPRO were trying to do. They were trying to damage the youth revolution. During COINTELPRO, an LA agent wrote a memo to Hoover saying what we have to do, this is when they were trying to neutralize the Panthers in LA, was go after the whites, the elite whites, the Hollywood whites, who were supporting the Panthers. In this one memo, it said what we have to make the whites think is that when the revolution finally happens, when the blacks rise up, they'll be lined up with everybody else and slaughtered. That was part of their operation. This could have been a Chaos or COINTELPRO operation to turn the world, the nation, the culture against hippies, the left wing, and the Black Panthers. Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski were like the social center of Hollywood. It wasn't just the movie people, it was the music people. That was a party house. Everybody went in and out of there. It kind of represented the elite of music, movies, Hollywood white people. So that would have been a very high-profile target. He's saying that the Tate House was targeted because famous, wealthy white people lived there, and the CIA and FBI knew that if some hippies murdered them, it would make hippies and the left wing look bad. But this only works as a motive for the CIA, not Charles Manson or Tex Watson. Was Manson knowingly carrying out the CIA's orders, targeting the Tate House to destroy the counterculture in the name of right-wing politics? If not, then by implication, we have to conclude that Manson had his own separate motive, unrelated to the CIA. What was that motive? What did Manson get out of it? O'Neill has yet to answer this question. And let's say we ignore all of this and accept that the Tate murders were a result of Charles Manson knowingly or unknowingly carrying out the CIA's objectives. That still leaves the LaBiancas and the entire second night of murders and attempted murders unaccounted for. But the LaBiancas weren't famous or noteworthy, and they weren't affiliated with Hollywood or politics. So if the LaBiancas weren't killed for the sake of these lofty, abstract intelligence goals, then what was the motive there? In his Rogan interview, O'Neill says that he suspects someone might have hired the family as hitmen to take out Leno LaBianca over a dispute regarding ownership of his family's grocery store chain. But if the family was acting as contract killers that night, why did they try to target Harold True's former residence before settling on the LaBianca house? Why did they go to Melba Cronkright's ranch in Malibu and Saladin Nadir's apartment on the same night? On the question of brainwashing, the chaos theory is similarly muddled. O'Neill is clearly implying that Manson somehow learned MKUltra mind control techniques and used them on his followers. As to how exactly this could have happened, chaos is light on specifics. If you were a prisoner participating in MKUltra experiments, the CIA doctor was trying to brainwash you, not teach you the secrets of mind control. Manson being an MKUltra test subject could explain Manson himself being brainwashed, but it doesn't explain how Manson developed these supposed mind control powers. Does O'Neill think Manson somehow reverse-engineered the brainwashing process just from being experimented on in prison? Because this is like saying that participating in a focus group makes you good at advertising, or that attending psychotherapy for a few months makes you a master psychologist. It just doesn't follow logically. The alternative is that O'Neill believes some CIA doctor took Manson under his wing and taught him the CIA's mind control tactics, but there's no evidence this ever happened to anyone, much less Manson specifically. And let's accept that Manson did learn the secret to creating Manchurian candidate killers from the CIA or elsewhere. Why did Manson personally shoot Bernard Crowe? Why did he cut Gary Hinman? Why did he go to the Tate House after the murders and tie up the LaBiancas before they were killed? If Manson had really created an army of mind-controlled assassins to commit murders on his behalf, why was he constantly having to personally involve himself in their crimes? Long before chaos ever came along, the central questions among Manson case researchers were, why did Manson do what he did, and what was Vincent Bugliosi trying to cover up by blaming the murders on a race war prophecy? In his Joe Rogan appearance, Tom O'Neill talks about finding interviews Bugliosi gave in the 1970s in which he admitted that Manson probably never actually believed in a coming Helter-Skelter race war, and O'Neill laments that he never got a chance to ask Bugliosi what Manson's real motive was. But I would like Tom O'Neill to answer the same question. If Manson didn't realize he was targeting the Tate House to fulfill the CIA's Operation Chaos objectives, then what was his motive? What did Manson think he was accomplishing? Because if he had his own motivations for the Tate murders totally separate and distinct from the CIA's, then it sounds like the crimes would have happened anyway, whether the CIA was involved or not. And as I hope I've shown in this video, the DA's office had plenty of embarrassing things to cover up about Hollywood, the music industry, and the victims before they ever even thought about Reeve Whitson, Roger Smith, or Operation Chaos. Despite the criticism, I still think Chaos is worth reading, and I don't mean to denigrate O'Neill or his 20 years of work in any way. He found valuable new information and ended up resolving some of the open questions regarding the case that people have been speculating about for years. But the Manson story branches in seemingly infinite different directions, with countless characters and institutions, all with their own opaque motives and secrets to keep hidden. O'Neill took on a monumental task, and it's no surprise that, rather than solving the case, he ended up just adding to the mystery.